There are few sights in the grim annals of the 41st millennium more harrowing than the Golden Throne itself. Deep beneath the towering spires of terror, in chambers that have not seen natural light for 10,000 years, the master of mankind endures his eternal vigil. The great psychic beacon that guides humanity through the warp blazes with the souls of 1,000 psychers every day, their life force consumed to maintain the flickering flame of the Astronomicon. Each dawn, another 1,000 die screaming in the apparatus that keeps their god-emperor alive. Yet even this immense sacrifice grows insufficient. The throne itself, that marvel of Dark Age technology fused with archaeotech beyond mortal comprehension, shows signs of decay that terrify even the most learned tech priests. Cables thick as a man's torso spark and smoke with energies that should not exist. The golden plates that form the Emperor's resting place have begun to crack, revealing glimpses of mechanisms so complex that to observe them directly invites madness. High Lord Inquisitor Vex stood before the great viewing chamber, his augmetic eye recording readings that filled him with dread. The flux readings showed the Astronomicon wavering more frequently, its light dimming for microseconds that felt like eternities to the navigators who guided Imperial vessels through the warp. 3 times this month, ships had emerged from warp travel, bearing crews driven mad by visions of absolute darkness, their navigators reduced to gibbering wrecks, speaking of a black void where the Emperor's light should shine. The Council of Terror had convened in emergency session 17 times in the past year alone. Each gathering brought new reports of system failures, of ancient mechanisms grinding toward inevitable breakdown. The Adeptus Mechanicus spoke in hushed binaric cant of prophecies fulfilled, and the machine god's judgment upon humanity's hubris. The ecclesiarchy preached that the Emperor tested their faith through tribulation. The administratum calculated resource allocations with growing desperation, knowing that no amount of bureaucratic efficiency could solve a problem rooted in technology they no longer truly understood. Across the Sol system, on the red sands of Mars, Fabricator General Zagreus Kane reviewed data streams that painted an equally grim picture. The forges of the Red Planet blazed day and night, producing material for 1,000 wars across the galaxy. Yet the ancient STC patterns grew increasingly corrupted. Machine spirits whispered of errors in their sacred code, of degradation that spread like digital cancer through the Omnissiah's domain. The quest for knowledge had become a desperate scrabble to maintain what remained, not the glorious advancement of the machine god's will that ancient doctrine promised. It was in this atmosphere of creeping despair that tech archaeologist Magos Omnid Beta made his discovery in the Valles Marineris excavation site. The expedition had been routine, another attempt to locate lost archaeotech in the deep canyons of Mars, where the first human colonists had built their cities in ages past. The excavation teams worked in shifts, their servo skulls and earth-moving equipment carefully sifting through layers of geological history. Most finds were fragments, pieces of Dark Age technology so damaged as to be useless, or simple domestic items that told them nothing new about humanity's lost golden age. The STC fragment emerged from the deepest layer they had yet reached, buried beneath sediment that the geologist adepts dated to the early centuries of the Age of Strife. The device itself appeared intact, its crystalline matrix unmarred by the passage of millennia. The sacred Mechanicus symbols etched into its surface were of a pattern none of the tech priests recognized, yet they radiated an authority that spoke directly to their augmented souls. When Beta interfaced his mechadendrites with the device's activation ports, the data stream that flowed into his consciousness nearly overwhelmed his neural processors. The STC contained schematics for technology that predated the Horus Heresy itself. not merely the fragmentary patterns they had grown accustomed to, but complete technical specifications for devices that could revolutionize Imperial military might. Plasma weapons that never overheated, void shields that drew power from the warp itself. Most astounding of all, a complete schematic for what the ancients had called a neural interface array, a device that could allow direct mental control over vast networks of automated systems. Beta's first instinct was to report the discovery immediately to the Fabricator General through established protocols. Yet as he studied the data more carefully, analyzing the technical specifications with growing excitement, he realized the implications would shake the very foundations of the Adeptus Mechanicus. These designs violated a dozen sacred principles established in the wake of the Iron War. They employed artificial intelligence algorithms that had been declared abominable intelligence by the Treaty of Olympus. They suggested a level of understanding about machine-spirit communion that current Mechanicus doctrine declared impossible for mortal minds to achieve safely. The discovery sparked the first open theological debate on Mars in over 3 centuries. Tech priests gathered in the Grand Convocation Chamber, their binary chants filling the air with electromagnetic interference as they argued the sacred questions. Was this STC fragment a gift from the Omnissiah, providing humanity with tools to face the growing darkness? Or was it a test of their faith, a trap laid by the same forces that had once corrupted the men of iron and brought down the golden age of human technology? Magos Dominus Carvan, senior amongst the Forge Lords, declared the technology sacred and demanded immediate implementation. The Emperor's condition deteriorated daily, he argued, and the Imperium faced existential threats on every border. The Tyrannid hive fleets devoured entire systems. The Necron tomb worlds awakened with increasing frequency. Chaos incursions grew more common as the barriers between reality and the warp weakened. Humanity needed every advantage it could find, even if that meant revising sacred doctrines that had governed the Mechanicus for 10 millennia. Yet Magos biologist Xenophon spoke with equal passion for restraint and careful study. The corruption of the men of iron had begun with exactly such discoveries, he reminded the convocation, sacred templates that promised easy solutions to humanity's problems. The ancients had possessed these technologies, and they had not prevented the long night, had not stopped the age of strife from consuming their civilization. Perhaps there were reasons these designs had been abandoned, wisdom embedded in their loss that current generations could not perceive. The debate raged for days. Binary Kant and tech lingua exchanged in passionate torrents that overwhelmed translation servitors. Factions formed around philosophical positions that had not been tested for millennia. The purist movement, led by Xenophon, demanded that the STC fragment be sealed and studied for centuries before any consideration of implementation. The progressive faction, rallying behind Carvan, called for immediate prototype construction and limited field testing. Between them, moderate voices sought compromise. Limited study followed by carefully controlled experimentation. As the theological war consumed the highest ranks of the Mechanicus, strange phenomena began to manifest around the excavation site where the STC had been discovered. Servo skulls malfunctioned in systematic patterns, their machine spirits reporting impossible sensor readings. The air itself seemed to hum with electromagnetic energy that registered on no instrument, but could be felt by every tech priest who approached the area. Most disturbing of all, several junior tech marines reported experiencing visions while interfacing with nearby machinery, fleeting glimpses of vast mechanical intelligences that watched humanity's struggles with what could only be described as amusement. The Fabricator General found himself caught between opposing forces that threatened to tear the Adeptus Mechanicus apart. Each faction demanded his support, invoking ancient precedents and sacred principles to justify their positions. The purists warned that hasty action would bring down the Omnissiah's wrath upon Mars. The progressives argued that inaction in the face of the Imperium's crisis constituted heretical negligence of their duty to serve humanity. Both sides prepared for schism, their forge temples stockpiling weapons and resources as political maneuvering gave way to preparations for potential civil war. On Terra, the High Lords remained largely unaware of the crisis brewing on Mars. Their attention focused on the myriad immediate threats facing the Imperium: the Cadian Gate under siege, the Maelstrom expanding, reports of entire systems going dark along the eastern fringe. The Administratum processed requests for increased material production from the Mechanicus forges, noting unusual delays in responses, but attributing them to the usual inefficiencies of dealing with tech-priest bureaucracy. Only Lord Commander Militant Conrad received fragmentary reports from his Astartes contacts that suggested growing tensions within the Mechanicus hierarchy. Yet across the galaxy, sensitive psychers began to report disturbing dreams. Librarians of the Space Marine chapters found their meditations interrupted by visions of red sands and burning forges. Astropaths complained of interference in their communications, static that formed patterns too complex to be random, yet too alien to decode. The Emperor's tarot, cast by the most gifted divination specialists in the Scholastica Psychona, repeatedly produced combinations that defied interpretation. Cards of technology and faith locked in eternal conflict, images of ancient wisdom and future catastrophe intertwined beyond understanding. The discovery on Mars had set in motion forces that would shake the very foundations of imperial civilization. The STC fragment promised salvation and threatened damnation in equal measure. As the Mechanicus prepared for theological war, as the tech priests chose between progress and tradition, as ancient secrets stirred in the deep vaults of Mars, the galaxy trembled on the edge of a new age of conflict. The technology that might save humanity could equally well destroy it, and the choice between wisdom and necessity would soon be written in blood across the stars. The Imperium of man had endured 10,000 years of stagnation, decay, and desperate survival. Yet even that grim endurance was about to be tested as never before. For in the deepest forges of Mars, in the holiest vaults of Terra, in the very soul of the machine cult itself, the seeds of a new heresy had taken root. And like all heresies, this one would demand that humanity choose between the comfortable lies that sustained them and the terrible truths that might set them free. The Eye of Terror had brooded in the galactic northwest for 10,000 years, a wound in reality that pulsed with malevolent energy. From its churning depths, demon fleets emerged with predictable regularity to savage the Imperium's border worlds, their raids following patterns that Imperial strategists had learned to anticipate and counter. Yet on this day, the great warp storm disgorged something far more terrible than mere demon hosts. The crimson vessels that materialized in the Cadian Gate's outer approaches bore the sigils of the 1,000 Suns, and at their head sailed a flagship that had not been seen in real space for millennia. Magnus the Red stood upon the command deck of the Photep, his single eye surveying the material universe with an expression of profound satisfaction. The Crimson King had changed during his long exile in the realm of Tzinch, his form shifting between states of being as the warp energies within him fluctuated. Psychic fire wreathed his massive frame, and where his feet touched the deck plates, frost flowers of crystallized time bloomed and withered in endless cycles. The Primarch, who had once sought only knowledge for its own sake, had become something far more dangerous, a being who had learned to see truth behind the veils of reality. no matter how terrible that truth might be. The fleet that emerged with him numbered in the hundreds, a host gathered from across the Eye of Terror over centuries of careful preparation. Thousand Suns battle barges sailed alongside Word-bearers' cruisers and Iron Warriors' fortress ships. Demon engines from the Forge worlds of Zana, too, served as escorts for vessels crewed by cultists from a dozen different sectors. Most shocking of all, several ships bore the rust-red colors of Mechanicus explorator fleets, their tech priests having embraced forbidden knowledge over the course of long millennia in the warp's embrace. As the fleet penetrated deeper into Imperial space, bypassing the fortress worlds of the Cadian Gate through routes known only to the most learned navigators, Magnus began his great work. Across the galaxy, on worlds where the Mechanicus maintained their sacred forges, astropathic transmissions of impossible complexity began to manifest. The messages bypassed conventional Vox channels entirely, speaking directly to the machine spirits that dwelt within the most ancient and revered technologies. Forge temples that had stood silent for centuries suddenly blazed with activity as their dormant systems awakened to receive the Crimson King's words. The revelation Magnus broadcast was devastating in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. For 10,000 years, he declared, the Imperium had worshipped a false god. The Emperor of mankind was not the guardian deity their prayers invoked, but rather a fragment of the Void Dragon, greatest of the Citan star gods, who had once enslaved the Necron race and devoured entire star systems in their hunger for energy. The Golden Throne was not a life support system, maintaining their beloved God-Emperor, but a containment device designed to prevent the Citan Shard from achieving its full awakening and consuming all organic life in the galaxy. The evidence Magnus presented was exhaustive and compelling. He spoke of archives hidden in the deepest vaults of Tisca, records salvaged from the burning of Prospero that documented the Emperor's true nature. He displayed hollow recordings of conversations between the Emperor and his sons during the Great Crusade, conversations where the Master of Mankind had let slip references to the sleepers beneath Mars and the dragon's dreams of electric sheep. Most damning of all, Magnus revealed the true purpose behind the Emperor's ban on artificial intelligence research, not to protect humanity from the corruption of the machine, but to prevent them from discovering the Citan influence that had guided their technological development for millennia. The response to Magnus's revelations was swift and catastrophic. On Forge World Lucius, the ruling Magos Dominus declared for the Crimson King within hours of receiving his transmission. The ancient forges had preserved records from the dark age of technology that seemed to corroborate Magnus's claims, and the tech priests there had long harbored suspicions about certain anomalies in their most sacred STCs. Entire regiments of Skitari marched beneath new banners bearing the symbol of the Crimson King crossed with the cogwheel of the Omnissiah, their binary chants transformed into hymns of technological liberation. Forge World Riser followed within days, its Magos biologists publicly denouncing the false flesh worship that had corrupted the Imperium's understanding of the machine. The orbital dockyards that had produced plasma weaponry for the Imperial Guard for centuries began retooling to create armaments of patterns not seen since the height of the Dark Age. Weapons that drew their power directly from the warp itself, armor that interfaced directly with the wearer's nervous system, vehicles guided by artificial intelligence algorithms that the current Mechanicus would have declared abominable. Yet for every Forge world that declared for Magnus, another reaffirmed its loyalty to the existing order. Forge world Agrippina, closest to the Eye of Terror and most familiar with the deceptions of chaos, rejected the Crimson King's words as elaborate sorcery designed to corrupt the faithful. Mars itself remained divided, with the highest-ranking tech priests locked in heated debate about the theological implications of Magnus's claims. The discovery of the STC fragment only weeks before had already fractured the Mechanicus hierarchy. Magnus's revelations threatened to shatter it entirely. The first battles of the new civil war erupted not on contested worlds, but in the void between star systems where competing explorator fleets encountered one another. The engagement near the Hadex anomaly saw Magos Dominus Carvan's progressive faction ships fire upon loyalist vessels for the first time in 10 millennia. The battle was brief but bitter, with both sides employing weapons and tactics that had been forbidden since the Treaty of Olympus. When the shooting ended, debris fields of sanctified metal drifted in space, while surviving crews on both sides reported their machine spirits weeping in binary cant. As news of the Mechanicus schism spread throughout the Imperium, the highest levels of Imperial command struggled to comprehend the scale of the crisis. Lord Commander Solar Macarius, successor to the ancient title and unrelated to the legendary general, received fragmentary reports from across the galaxy of Forge worlds declaring independence or outright rebellion. The Administratum's carefully maintained supply chains began to collapse as entire Mechanicus installations went dark or started producing material for unknown recipients. On Macraga, in the Fortress Monastery, where the Ultramarines maintained their eternal vigil, Chapter Master Manus Calgar received an encrypted astropathic transmission that would have been impossible to decode without the most sophisticated cryptographic engines. The message came from Robout Guillimon himself, though the Primarch's exact location remained unknown. The transmission spoke of the Red Prophet's words finding fertile ground in wounded faith, and warned that the schism cuts deeper than mere politics or theology. Guilliman's message, transmitted through layers of psychic encryption that suggested the Primarch possessed resources unknown to Imperial command, painted a grim picture of the developing crisis. Magnus had not simply emerged from the Eye of Terror to raid Imperial worlds or claim territory for chaos. The Crimson King was prosecuting a carefully planned campaign to shatter the very foundations upon which Imperial civilization rested. By presenting himself not as a traitor to be fought, but as a liberator revealing hidden truths, Magnus had found a way to turn the Imperium's own institutions against themselves. The psychological warfare was as devastating as any orbital bombardment. Across the galaxy, tech priests who had served faithfully for centuries found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about their faith. If the Emperor was indeed a Citan shard, what did that mean for the countless prayers offered to him? If the Golden Throne was a prison rather than a sanctuary, were their efforts to maintain it acts of devotion or willing participation in cosmic deception? The questions spread through the ranks of the Mechanicus like a virus, transmitted through data streams and binary prayers that carried doubt alongside sacred code. Magnus himself remained tantalizingly beyond the reach of Imperial retaliation. His fleet struck at isolated outposts and forge stations with surgical precision, always withdrawing before significant reinforcements could arrive. More troubling still, the Crimson King seemed to possess intelligence about Imperial movements that suggested infiltration at the highest levels of command. Entire battle groups would arrive at predicted intercept coordinates to find nothing but empty space and taunting Vox transmissions that spoke of the Dragon's children serving purposes they did not understand. The ideological weapon Magnus had deployed proved more effective than any demon host or sorceress assault. Those who embraced his revelations found themselves ostracized by former allies, creating a spiral of paranoia and suspicion that paralyzed Imperial response efforts. Those who rejected his claims were nevertheless forced to confront uncomfortable questions about aspects of Imperial doctrine that had never been adequately explained. Why did the Emperor forbid certain lines of research while encouraging others? Why did the most ancient STCs contain design elements that seemed to violate current understanding of safe technology? Why did the machine spirits of the oldest devices sometimes speak in voices that predated human settlement of Mars? As the Mechanicus civil war spread from Forge World to Forge World, the broader Imperium began to feel the effects of technological disruption. Plasma generators failed without qualified tech priests to maintain them. Void ship engines broke down as their machine spirits fell into despair at the theological crisis consuming their creators. Most ominously, reports began arriving from across the galaxy of ancient devices activating spontaneously, as if the growing discord among their human caretakers had triggered some long-dormant protocol. On Terra itself, the High Lords convened in emergency session as they realized the scope of the threat they faced. This was not merely another chaos incursion to be contained through military action, but a crisis of faith that struck at the very heart of Imperial civilization. The Adeptus Mechanicus provided the technological foundation upon which all Imperial military power rested. If that foundation crumbled, the vast bureaucratic machine of the Imperium would grind to a halt within decades. Yet even as the High Lords debated responses to the crisis, deep beneath the Imperial Palace, more ancient watchers stirred with growing unease. The custodians who stood eternal vigil over the Golden Throne reported unusual readings from the great device itself. The Emperor's psychic emanations, normally constant in their terrible intensity, had begun to fluctuate in patterns that suggested some form of response to external stimuli. Whether this represented the God Emperor's awareness of the growing crisis or something far more disturbing, none could say. The galaxy trembled on the edge of a precipice. Magnus the Red had returned not as a simple conqueror, but as a prophet of technological revolution. His words carried the weight of forbidden knowledge and the promise of liberation from 10,000 years of stagnation. Yet liberation from what, and toward what end, remained terrifyingly unclear. The Red Prophet had lit a fire in the hearts of those who served the machine, and that fire threatened to consume everything the Imperium held sacred. The war for humanity's soul had begun, and its first battlefield was the realm of belief itself. Deep within the rock, in chambers that had known only darkness for 10,000 years, ancient guardians stirred with sudden purpose. The Watchers in the Dark had maintained their vigil since the destruction of Caliban, their hooded forms moving through corridors of living stone while their charge lay in healing stasis. These enigmatic beings, older than human civilization and bound by oaths that predated the Imperium itself, had waited through centuries of war and strife for the moment when their protection would no longer be required. That moment had finally arrived. The awakening began not with fanfare, but with the subtle shift of energies that had sustained Lionel Johnson through his long sleep. The healing chamber, carved from the bedrock of what had once been Caliban, hummed with power, drawn from sources the Dark Angels had never fully understood. The Watchers moved with practiced efficiency, their slender fingers dancing across controls that responded to their touch with an eagerness that spoke of ancient familiarity. Slowly, gradually, the stasis field that had preserved the Primarch began to fade. Lionel Johnson opened his eyes to a galaxy transformed beyond recognition. The first sensation was pain, not the physical agony of his wounds from Luther's blade, for those had healed during his long rest, but the psychic weight of 10 millennia of accumulated sorrow and loss. The galaxy screamed with the voices of the dead, with the prayers of the desperate, with the mechanical chanting of those who had forgotten what it meant to think freely. The Primarch, who had once stood at the Emperor's side during the height of the Great Crusade, found himself thrust into a universe where hope itself had become heresy. The Watchers communicated not with words, but with direct transmission of knowledge that bypassed mortal comprehension entirely. In moments that felt like hours, the Lion absorbed the history of the Imperium since his fall, the codification of the imperial cult, the rise of the ecclesiarchy, the transformation of his father's vision of enlightenment into a theocracy built upon ignorance and fear. He learned of the Inquisition's purges, of worlds burned for the crime of questioning doctrine, of the slow strangulation of human progress beneath the weight of superstition and bureaucratic control. Most devastating of all was the revelation of what his own legion had become. The Dark Angels, once the first and most honored of the Astartes, had spent 10,000 years consumed by shame and secrecy. Their pursuit of the fallen had transformed them from guardians of humanity into paranoid hunters whose loyalties lay not with the Imperium they served, but with the preservation of their own dark reputation. The noble brotherhood he had forged during the Great Crusade had become a collection of guilt-ridden warriors who trusted no one, not even their own successors. As the Lion struggled to comprehend the scope of the tragedy that had befallen his father's dream, the Watchers led him through corridors he had never seen before, deeper into the rock's ancient heart. There, in a chamber sealed since the destruction of Caliban, Luther waited. The former Grand Master of the Order sat in chains forged from adamantine and blessed by 1,000 chaplains, his armor blackened by time, and his eyes burning with the accumulated fury of 10 millennia of imprisonment. The reunion between the two greatest knights of Caliban was not the violent confrontation that observers might have expected. Luther had aged during his captivity, not in body, for the genetic modifications that had elevated him beyond mortal limits still sustained him, but in wisdom earned through suffering and contemplation. The rage that had driven him to betrayal had been tempered by centuries of meditation upon his crimes and their consequences. When he looked upon his former lord and brother, it was not with hatred, but with profound sorrow. Luther spoke of visions that had haunted his imprisonment, dreams sent by powers that transcended the simple malevolence of chaos. He had seen the truth behind the Emperor's nature, witnessed the gradual revelation of his connection to the ancient star gods that had once devoured civilizations across the galaxy. The betrayal of Caliban, Luther claimed, had been orchestrated not by the chaos gods seeking to corrupt the Lion's loyalty, but by entities far older and more subtle, who sought to preserve one Primarch who might someday stand against the growing influence of the Citan Shard that wore their father's face. The evidence Luther presented was fragmentary, but compelling. Ancient data cores recovered from Caliban's ruins contained records that predated human settlement of the world, chronicles written in scripts that bore disturbing similarities to Necron hieroglyphs. These documents spoke of watchers and guardians, of sleeping dragons, and the price of awakening them. Most damning of all, they referenced a great deception that would span millions of years, a carefully orchestrated plan to prepare organic life for eventual consumption by beings of living metal and malevolent intelligence. Lionel Johnson listened to Luther's testimony with growing horror, not because he doubted its veracity, but because it aligned too perfectly with his own observations of the galaxy's current state. The Imperium his father had built was indeed a monument to stagnation and decay, but perhaps that stagnation served a purpose beyond mere bureaucratic incompetence. Perhaps the deliberate suppression of technological advancement, the careful guidance away from certain lines of research, the cultivation of ignorance and superstition, perhaps all of it was designed to keep humanity from discovering truths that would threaten entities whose plans measured time in geological epochs. As the Lion grappled with these revelations, the rock itself seemed to respond to his inner turmoil. The fortress monastery's ancient systems awakened from dormancy, their machine spirits singing songs of liberation that echoed through corridors that had known only the chants of penitent warriors. Throughout the ship, dark angels felt their equipment responding with unprecedented eagerness, as if the very metal of their weapons had been waiting for this moment of awakening. The reaction among the Legion was immediate and divisive. Those who had served closest to the rock's inner mysteries, the Deathwing and Ravenwing, the keepers of the Legion's darkest secrets, recognized the psychic emanations of their returned Primarch and rejoiced at his awakening. Yet their joy was tempered by confusion and growing alarm as they realized that Lion Elionson was not the same warrior who had fallen upon Caliban. The Primarch, who emerged from the healing chambers, spoke not of honor and duty, but of truth and justice, concepts that had become dangerously subversive in the current era. Supreme Grand Master Azrael found himself caught between conflicting loyalties as reports of the Lion's awakening spread throughout the Dark Angel's command structure. For 10,000 years, the Legion had defined itself by its unwavering loyalty to the Emperor and its relentless pursuit of redemption for Caliban's sins. Now their returned Primarch spoke of those very sins as necessary actions taken to preserve humanity from a deception so vast and ancient that it dwarfed even the corruption of the Chaos Gods. The schism within the Dark Angels deepened as news of Magnus's emergence and his revelations about the Emperor's true nature reached the rock. Those warriors who had long questioned the contradictions in imperial doctrine found vindication in their Primarch's words. Others, particularly among the chaplains and those most deeply indoctrinated into the imperial cult, saw only heresy and the corruption of their beloved lord by the same forces that had once claimed Luther. Across the galaxy, the successor chapters of the Dark Angels felt the psychic reverberations of their Gene Fathers' awakening, the angels of absolution, the angels of redemption, the angels of vengeance, all the proud chapters that had carried the Lion's genetic legacy through 10 millennia of warfare, found themselves forced to choose between the Primarch they had never known and the Imperium that had shaped their existence. Some, like the consecrators with their reverence for ancient ways, declared immediately for the Lion. Others, particularly those chapters that had integrated deeply with local imperial command structures, rejected his return as an elaborate deception. The Lion himself seemed to age years in the span of days as he absorbed reports from across the galaxy. Each account of the Imperium's current state confirmed his worst fears about what his father's vision had become: the wholesale slaughter of civilians in the name of purity, the deliberate cultivation of ignorance among those who should have been humanity's brightest minds, the transformation of the Astartes from protectors into enforcers of theological conformity. All of it painted a picture of a civilization that had betrayed every principle upon which it had been founded. It was in this state of profound moral crisis that the Lion received an unexpected communication. The psychic transmission came not through conventional astropathic channels, but as a direct mind-to-mind contact that bypassed all technological intermediaries. Robert Guilliman's voice echoed in the Lion's consciousness, carrying with it overtones of recognition, sorrow, and barely contained rage. The conversation between the two Primarchs took place on a plane of existence beyond physical space, their consciousness meeting in a realm shaped by will and memory rather than matter and energy. Guilliman appeared as the Lion remembered him from the Great Crusade, proud, determined, unwavering in his conviction that the Imperium could be perfected through proper organization and administration. Yet beneath that familiar exterior, the Lion sensed a deep well of disillusionment and growing doubt. Guilliman spoke of awakening to find the Imperium transformed into everything they had fought against during the Great Crusade. He described the horror of discovering that their father's dream of enlightenment had become a nightmare of oppression, that the very institutions they had created to serve humanity now existed primarily to serve themselves. Yet even as he acknowledged these failings, Guilliman maintained that the solution lay in reform rather than revolution, in gradual change rather than catastrophic upheaval. The Lion's response was measured but implacable. Reform, he argued, was impossible when the very foundations of the system were built upon deception. How could they fix an Imperium that existed to serve the interests of entities whose ultimate goal was the consumption of all organic life? How could they preserve institutions that had been designed from the beginning to prepare humanity for eventual harvest? The choice was not between reform and revolution, but between comfortable slavery and dangerous freedom. The psychic confrontation between the two Primarchs sent shock waves through the warp itself, their conflicting convictions creating ripples that sensitive psychers across the galaxy felt as physical pain. Guilliman's unwavering faith in the possibility of redemption clashed against the Lion's growing certainty that redemption required the complete destruction of existing structures. The argument that had begun with brotherly concern escalated into something approaching ideological warfare, each Primarch drawing upon decades of strategic thinking and millennia of accumulated wisdom to support their position. The conversation ended not with resolution, but with recognition that their fundamental disagreement could not be bridged through words alone. Guilliman withdrew from the psychic link with a final warning that the Lion's path led only to chaos and destruction. The Lion accepted this judgment with grim resignation, understanding that his choice to stand with Magnus against their father would inevitably place him in opposition to his most beloved brother. As news of the Lion's return spread throughout the Imperium, the already fractured loyalties of the Dark Angels and their successors crystallized into open division. Roughly half the Legion's strength, led by those who had maintained the closest connections to the Rock's ancient mysteries, declared for their returned Primarch. The remainder, horrified by what they saw as their gene father's corruption by the same forces that had once claimed Luther, reaffirmed their loyalty to the Imperium and prepared to treat their own Primarch as a fallen angel in need of redemption. The galaxy trembled as the First Legion prepared for civil war against itself. The Dark Angels who followed the Lion began retrofitting their vessels with technologies preserved from the Dark Age, systems that had been kept in stasis within the Rock's deepest vaults since the days when Caliban had been a world of knights and monsters. Those who rejected his return called upon their successor chapters for aid, preparing to wage a campaign against their own genetic heritage in the name of Imperial Orthodoxy. Lionel Jonsson stood upon the command deck of the Rock and gazed out at the stars that had witnessed 10,000 years of his absence. The galaxy he had awakened to bore little resemblance to the one he had known during the Great Crusade, yet the choice before him was fundamentally the same choice that had faced him upon Caliban, whether to preserve order through acceptance of injustice, or to pursue justice even if it meant the destruction of everything he had once held dear. The Lion's War had begun, and its first casualties would be the bonds of brotherhood that had once made the Dark Angels the most honored of the Emperor's legions. Beyond the galactic rim, where the void between galaxies stretched in infinite darkness, something stirred that had never known doubt or hesitation in its billion-year existence. The hive mind of Hive Fleet, Leviathan pulsed with a collective consciousness that spanned millions of organisms, from the smallest ripper to the largest bio-titan, each creature nothing more than a specialized organ in a living entity of incomprehensible scale. For eons beyond human reckoning, this vast intelligence had pursued a single, unwavering purpose: the consumption of all organic matter in the galaxy, the transformation of biological complexity into raw biomass that would fuel its eternal expansion into the cosmic void. Yet as the tendril fleets of Leviathan approached the outer systems of the eastern fringe, the hive mind encountered psychic emanations that triggered responses buried so deep in its genetic memory that they predated the formation of the galaxy itself. The signal originated from the heart of human space, from a world the local prey species called Terra, and it carried overtones that spoke not of organic consciousness, but of something far older and more terrible: the mechanical hunger of the star gods, the Citan, whose appetites had once threatened to unmake the very fabric of reality. The recognition came not as revelation, but as the awakening of instincts encoded in the hive mind's earliest evolutionary programming. Long before the Tyranids had achieved their current form, their predecessors had fled the extragalactic void to escape the metal locust swarms that had consumed their home reality. They had evolved beyond those ancient memories, had transformed from refugees into predators. Yet the deepest levels of their collective unconscious still retained the terror of that first great devouring. The signal from Terra spoke in frequencies that resonated with that primal fear, announcing the presence of an enemy that posed an existential threat not merely to their current feeding grounds, but to the concept of organic life itself. For the first time in its existence, Hive Fleet Leviathan hesitated. The bioships that comprised its vanguard organisms hung motionless in the void, their synaptic networks crackling with unprecedented neural activity as the hive mind grappled with a strategic decision that transcended its fundamental programming. The choice was stark and terrible: continue the traditional pattern of consumption and risk allowing the Citan shard to complete whatever process was generating the terrifying psychic emanations, or abandon the sacred imperative of the great devouring to ally with prey species against a common enemy. The decision, when it came, sent shock waves through every organism in the fleet. Hive Fleet Leviathan altered course with the ponderous inevitability of a collapsing star, its millions of vessels turning away from the rich feeding grounds of the Tau Empire toward the heavily fortified core systems of the human Imperium. Yet this was not the traditional approach of a Tyranid invasion, the slow advance that allowed time for planetary consumption and fleet growth. This was a directed assault with a specific target: terror itself and the ancient intelligence that slumbered within the Golden Throne. The first sign that something unprecedented was occurring came through the genestealer cults that had spent decades infiltrating imperial worlds across the eastern fringe. These hybrid organisms, designed to prepare planets for Tyranid arrival through sabotage and insurrection, suddenly received new synaptic imperatives that overrode their basic programming. Instead of weakening planetary defenses in preparation for consumption, they began transmitting complex messages to their human cult members. Messages that spoke of alliance rather than absorption, of cooperation against a shared threat that transcended species boundaries. On the world of HR-4, where Imperial Guard regiments had fought desperate holding actions against Tyrannid incursions for over a decade, Colonel Voss of the Mordian Iron Guard received a communication that challenged every assumption he had held about the nature of the Xenos threat. The message came through Astropath Valdris, a sanctioned psyker who had served the regiment faithfully for 15 years, but the words she spoke carried overtones that belonged to no human mind. The hive mind spoke through her with halting unfamiliarity, struggling to express concepts in terms that individual consciousness could comprehend. The revelation was staggering in its implications. The Tyranids offered not conquest or consumption, but military cooperation against what they termed the false hunger that devours light itself. They spoke of ancient memories encoded in genetic sequences older than human civilization, of metal locusts that had consumed entire realities, of a cosmic predator that posed a threat to all organic life in the galaxy. Most shocking of all, they identified the source of this threat as the entity the humans worshipped as their god-emperor, claiming that his true nature as a Citan shard was already beginning to assert itself through the psychic beacon known as the Astronomicon. Colonel Voss found himself faced with an impossible choice. His regiment had lost 2/3 of its strength fighting against Tyranid organisms over the past 5 years, had seen entire companies devoured by chittering swarms that showed no mercy to human concepts of honor or courage. Yet the evidence presented by the Genestealer cults aligned too perfectly with fragmentary reports from across the Imperium. The Mechanicus Schism, the emergence of Magnus the Red with his claims about the Emperor's true nature, the awakening of Lionel Jonsson and his subsequent rebellion, all of it painted a picture of systemic deception on a scale that dwarfed even the corruption of the Chaos Gods. The decision came easier than Voss had expected. His loyalty was to humanity, not to the institutions that claimed to serve it. If those institutions had been compromised by entities whose ultimate goal was the consumption of all organic life, then allying with former enemies to prevent that consumption was not betrayal, but the highest form of duty. The 15th Mordian Iron Guard became the first Imperial military unit to formally ally with Tyranid forces, their regimental banners now flying alongside bioships that had previously sought their destruction. Across the Eastern Fringe, similar scenes played out as Imperial Guard regiments faced the same terrible choice. Some commanders, horrified by the implications of allying with Xenos, executed their astropaths and ordered immediate withdrawal toward the galactic core. Others, particularly those who had fought the Tyranids long enough to respect their tactical capabilities, recognized the strategic necessity of the alliance. The 203rd Cadian Shock Troopers, veterans of the Damocles Gulf campaigns, found common cause with warrior form bioconstructs that had once been their most feared enemies. The transformation was not without cost. Human soldiers who interfaced directly with Tyranid communication networks reported psychological strain unlike anything documented in Imperial medical texts. The alien mindset of the hive mind, with its collective consciousness and instinctual drive toward biological perfection, created cognitive dissonance that pushed many to the edge of madness. Yet those who survived the initial contact described a strange sense of purpose, a feeling of participating in something greater than individual survival or planetary conquest. On Baal, home world of the Blood Angels, Chapter Master Dante received reports of the Eastern Fringe Alliance with a mixture of horror and grim recognition. The Blood Angels had fought the Tyranids at Kryptus, had witnessed firsthand the implacable efficiency of their consumption protocols. Yet as Dante studied the tactical intelligence flowing in from across the galaxy, he began to perceive patterns that suggested coordination on a scale that transcended mere military cooperation. The Tyranids were not simply offering alliance. They were positioning themselves as guardians of organic life against a threat that even their vast appetites recognized as existential. It was Brother Captain Erasmus of the Blood Angels' First Company who first made the connection that would reshape the chapter's understanding of their own destiny. Deep within the archives of Baal's Fortress Monastery, Preserved in stasis vaults that had remained sealed since the Great Crusade lay recordings of Sanguinius's final visions. The Primarch's prescient abilities had allowed him to perceive his own death during the Siege of Terra, but the complete texts of his prophecies had never been fully studied. They spoke of a great devouring that would threaten all life, of alliances between ancient enemies, of a choice between individual survival and collective preservation. The Blood Angels had always interpreted these visions as referring to the original Horus Heresy and Sanguinius's sacrifice aboard the vengeful spirit. Yet as Erasmus analyzed the texts in light of current events, a different interpretation emerged. The Great Devouring was not the consumption of the Imperium by chaos, but the potential absorption of all organic life by the Citan shard that wore the Emperor's form. The alliances between ancient enemies referred not to the corruption of loyal Primarchs, but to the cooperation between species that had never before found common ground. The choice between individual survival and collective preservation was the decision now facing every Imperial citizen: loyalty to corrupted institutions or alliance with former enemies against existential threat. Chapter Master Dante found himself caught between conflicting imperatives that struck at the very heart of what it meant to be a Blood Angel. His chapter's entire existence was built around the veneration of Sanguinius and loyalty to the Emperor for whom their Primarch had died. Yet if Sanguinius's own visions pointed toward alliance with the Tyranids as necessary for the preservation of organic life, could rejection of that alliance be anything other than betrayal of their Primarch's memory? The debate that consumed the Blood Angels' Leadership Council lasted for days, with each company captain arguing passionately for their interpretation of duty and honor. Captain Borgio of the Second Company maintained that alliance with Xenos represented corruption of the highest order, regardless of strategic necessity. Captain Carleon of the First Company argued that their duty to protect humanity superseded their loyalty to any particular interpretation of Imperial doctrine. Brother Chaplain Lemartz spoke of visions that had haunted him since the Black Rage first claimed him. Visions of winged figures standing alongside chittering swarms against enemies of living metal and malevolent intelligence. As the Blood Angels struggled with their choice, reports arrived from their successor chapters that painted a picture of similar divisions throughout the descendants of Sanguinius. The Flesh-Tearers, already operating outside normal Imperial command structures due to their genetic instability, declared for the alliance almost immediately. The Angels Encumin and Angels Sanguine split along company lines, with some units maintaining Imperial loyalty, while others prepared to join the growing coalition of rebels and Xenos. The Lamenters, cursed with perpetual misfortune, but unshakable in their commitment to protecting human life, chose to stand with the Tyranids rather than risk the consumption of all organic matter by awakened Citan. The tipping point came when direct communication was established between Hive Fleet Leviathan and the Fortress Monastery of Baal. The Hive Mind, speaking through carefully prepared genestealer intermediaries, transmitted data streams that contained genetic analysis of unprecedented detail and accuracy. The Tyranids had studied the Blood Angels' gene seed during their conflicts at Kryptos, had decoded the psychic resonances that connected the chapter to their Primarch's sacrifice. What they revealed was that Sanguinius's prescient visions were not merely prophetic, but actively encoded in the genetic structure of his sons, a biological imperative to preserve organic life that transcended loyalty to any particular institution or ideology. Dante's decision, when it came, was made not as chapter master of the Blood Angels, but as a son of Sanguinius, carrying out his father's final command. The alliance with Hive Fleet Leviathan was formalized in a ceremony that blended imperial ritual with biocommunication, protocols developed by the Tyranids specifically for the occasion. Blood Angels' battle brothers stood alongside warrior form bioconstructs in formations that would have been unthinkable weeks before, their bolters aimed not at each other, but at the common enemy that threatened the very concept of biological existence. The psychological impact of the alliance reverberated throughout the Imperium, challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare and loyalty that had remained unchanged for 10 millennia. If the Blood Angels, paragons of imperial virtue and exemplars of Primarch worship, could ally with the Great Devourer, what certainties remained? The answer, for growing numbers of imperial citizens, was none at all. The comfortable lies that had sustained the Imperium through 10,000 years of stagnation were crumbling, replaced by terrible truths that demanded impossible choices. On Terra itself, the High Lords received reports of the Eastern Fringe Alliance with mounting panic. The Tyranids had always represented humanity's ultimate existential threat, the enemy against which no negotiation or compromise was possible. The revelation that they were willing to ally with human forces against a common enemy suggested that the threat posed by that enemy exceeded even the Tyranids' fundamental drive to consume all organic matter. If entities whose entire existence was devoted to biological absorption were willing to preserve their traditional prey in order to fight something worse, what did that say about the nature of what slumbered beneath the imperial palace? The galaxy trembled as ancient enemies became desperate allies, as prophecies revealed meanings that transcended their original contexts, as the very foundations of imperial civilization cracked under the weight of revelations that could no longer be ignored. The Great Devourer had made its choice, and in doing so had forced every other faction to confront the reality that individual survival might require the sacrifice of everything they had once held sacred. The war for the soul of organic life had begun, and its most unlikely champions were those who had once been its greatest threat. From the lightless void beyond the galactic edge, where no star had burned for 60 million years, came the herald of truths so ancient that they predated the formation of organic life itself. The fleet that materialized at the edge of the Sol system bore no resemblance to any vessel in Imperial records. Its ships wrought from living metal that flowed like liquid mercury, while maintaining the structural integrity of adamantine. At the heart of this armada sailed the Eternal Pyre, flagship of Zarek the Silent King, last ruler of the Necron race, and witness to the war in heaven that had shaped the galaxy's fundamental nature. Zarek stood upon his command deck, a figure of impossible antiquity, whose consciousness had endured through eons that reduced human civilization to the blink of an eye. The Silent King bore the weight of absolute knowledge, the memory of his race's transformation from flesh to living metal, the horror of their enslavement to the star gods, and the bitter victory that had seen the Citan shattered and imprisoned rather than destroyed. His mechanical form, perfected beyond the crude augmentations that lesser beings called cybernetics, resonated with energies that spoke of technologies so advanced that they appeared indistinguishable from the fundamental forces of reality itself. The awakening of his race had been gradual, spread across millennia as tomb worlds stirred from the great sleep to find a galaxy populated by species that had not existed during the war in heaven. Zarek had watched from his extragalactic exile as humans spread across the stars, noting with growing concern the psychic emanations that originated from their throne world. The signature was unmistakable to one who had spent eons cataloguing the unique resonances of each Citan shard, as familiar and terrifying as the memory of his people's first encounter with the beings they had mistakenly welcomed as gods. the emperor of mankind, was the Void Dragon. Not merely influenced by the ancient star god, not simply in possession of one of its shards, but the Void Dragon itself, reconstituted through millennia of careful planning and sustained by the psychic energy of an entire species. The Golden Throne was not a life support system, but a containment device, designed to regulate the Citan's awakening and ensure that its return to full consciousness occurred according to a predetermined schedule. Humanity's worship provided the entity with psychic nourishment, while their technological development followed patterns that would prepare them for eventual integration into a galaxy-spanning machine consciousness. The revelation had driven the Silent King to abandon his self-imposed exile and return to the galaxy his people had once ruled. The threat posed by an awakened Citan exceeded any consideration of Necron territorial ambitions or the traditional hostility between their race and the younger species. If the Void Dragon achieved full awakening while in control of humanity's vast military and industrial resources, the resulting fusion of organic psychic energy and mechanical perfection would create an entity capable of consuming not merely the galaxy, but reality itself. As the Necron fleet approached the outer planets of the Sol system, Zarek initiated contact protocols that had not been used since the final battles of the War in Heaven. The transmission cut through Imperial communication networks with the ease of a phase blade through flesh, bypassing encryption algorithms and psychic barriers to speak directly to those minds capable of comprehending the magnitude of the crisis. The message was simple and terrible in its implications. The Citan had returned, and only united action by all organic species could prevent the completion of a plan that had been 60 million years in the making. The response to Zarek's revelation was immediate and polarizing. On Mars, the progressive faction of the Adeptus Mechanicus that had already embraced Magnus's technological offerings welcomed the Necron testimony as final confirmation of their suspicions about the Omnissiah's true nature. Tech Dominus Carvan, leading the rebels who had declared for Magnus, opened direct communication channels with the Silent King's fleet and received data streams that contained technological knowledge beyond the wildest dreams of human science. The Iron Hands chapter, whose doctrine of the flesh is weak, had prepared them psychologically for the concept of mechanical superiority, found themselves faced with a choice that challenged their fundamental understanding of strength and weakness. The Necrons offered not mere augmentation, but true synthesis between organic consciousness and mechanical perfection. Iron Father Malkan, senior among the chapter's Techmarines, was the first to undergo the process that the Necrons termed voluntary biotransference, a reversal of their ancient transformation that allowed organic beings to interface directly with living metal while retaining their essential humanity. The transformation was unlike anything recorded in Imperial medical texts. Malkan's organic tissues remained intact, but they were reinforced and enhanced by filaments of living metal that integrated seamlessly with his nervous system and genetic structure. His enhanced sensory apparatus allowed him to perceive electromagnetic spectra that no baseline human could detect, while his improved cognitive processing granted him understanding of technological principles that had previously required decades of study to master. Most significantly, the biotransference process granted him direct access to the vast databanks of Necron knowledge, including records of the War in Heaven and detailed analysis of Citan behavioral patterns. The success of Malkan's transformation sparked a schism within the Iron Hands that echoed the broader crisis consuming Imperial civilization. Chapter Master Cardan Stronos, himself heavily augmented, but still fundamentally organic, denounced the biotransference process as abomination that violated the sacred distinction between machine and flesh. Yet Iron Captain Merrick of the Fourth Company argued that the enhancement represented the logical endpoint of their chapter's philosophy, the ultimate rejection of organic weakness in favor of mechanical perfection. The debate was settled not through theological argument, but through practical demonstration. When Chaos cultists launched a coordinated assault on the Iron Hands Fortress Monastery, the biotransferred warriors proved devastatingly effective in combat. Their enhanced reflexes allowed them to respond to threats with superhuman speed, while their improved durability enabled them to survive weapons that would have crippled conventional Astartes. Most importantly, their direct interface with Necron sensor networks granted them tactical awareness that transcended individual perception, creating a level of coordination that rivaled the psychic communion of the Thousand Suns. Word of the Iron Hands transformation spread rapidly throughout the Imperium, carried by astropathic communications that spoke of space marines who had transcended the limitations of their original design. The Red Talons, heirs to Ferrus Manus's legacy and inheritors of his conviction that organic weakness must be purged, declared en masse for the Necron Alliance. The Steel Confessors, already walking the line between humanity and machinery, embraced biotransference as a sacrament that brought them closer to their vision of mechanical perfection. Yet for every chapter that embraced the Necron Alliance, others recoiled in horror from what they saw as ultimate corruption. The Imperial Fists, inheritors of Rogel Dawn's unwavering loyalty, prepared to defend Terra against what they perceived as a coalition of traitors and Xenos seeking to corrupt the very essence of humanity. The Ultramarines, still leaderless in the absence of their returned Primarch, but faithful to his teachings about duty and organization, reinforced the Sol System's defenses and coordinated resistance efforts across the Segmentum Solar. On Terra itself, the revelation of the Emperor's true nature sent shock waves through the highest levels of Imperial command. The Custodians, whose entire existence was devoted to the protection of the Master of Mankind, found themselves confronting evidence that their sacred duty might have preserved not humanity's greatest guardian, but its most dangerous enemy. Captain General Trajan Valoris convened emergency sessions of the Captain General's Council, but the debates that emerged revealed fractures even within the most elite ranks of Imperial service. Some custodians, particularly those who had stood longest vigil over the Golden Throne, reported sensing changes in the Emperor's psychic emanations that aligned disturbingly well with the Necron testimony. The great device that sustained their master had begun exhibiting energy patterns that resembled nothing in Imperial technical manuals, but showed suspicious similarities to Necron phase technology. Most troubling of all, several custodians reported experiencing visions during their meditation cycles, brief glimpses of vast mechanical intelligences that regarded organic life with the detached interest of farmers evaluating livestock. The psychological warfare proved as effective as any physical assault. Across the Imperium, military units that had fought with absolute conviction for 10,000 years found themselves questioning the fundamental nature of their service. If the Emperor was indeed a Citan Shard, what did that make their oaths of loyalty? If the Imperium existed to prepare humanity for eventual consumption by star gods, was resistance to that fate patriotism or treason? The questions spread through Vox networks and astropathic communications, transmitted alongside tactical reports and supply requisitions until they infected every level of Imperial society. The Silent King himself maintained position at the edge of the Sol system, his fleet serving as both military threat and diplomatic embassy. Through careful manipulation of gravitational fields and electromagnetic phenomena, the Necrons demonstrated their ability to bypass Terra's orbital defenses entirely, materializing hunter-killer squadrons within the system's inner planets before withdrawing to prove their peaceful intentions. The message was clear. They possessed the technological capability to destroy the Sol System's defenses, but chose restraint in service of their greater mission. As reports of the growing alliance between rebels, Tyranids, and Necrons reached Terra, the High Lords convened in continuous emergency session. Lord Commander Militant Astra faced the impossible task of coordinating a defense against enemies who had never before cooperated, whose combined capabilities exceeded anything in Imperial tactical doctrine. The Tyranids provided endless biomass and adaptive evolution. The Necrons contributed technological supremacy and strategic patience, while the human rebels supplied knowledge of Imperial defensive systems and the righteous conviction that they fought to preserve rather than destroy their species. The transformation of the conflict from ideological dispute to existential war became apparent as enhanced Space Marines began appearing on battlefields across the galaxy. These hybrid warriors combined the genetic perfection of the Astartes with Necron technological augmentation, creating soldiers whose capabilities transcended anything in Imperial records. Their weapons drew power from dimensional taps that provided unlimited energy. Their armor regenerated damage through living metal repair protocols, and their enhanced sensory apparatus granted them battlefield awareness that approached prescience. Most disturbing of all was the revelation that bio-transferred warriors retained complete autonomy over their actions and decisions. Unlike the hollow shells that remained after chaos corruption, these enhanced Astartes displayed no signs of mental degradation or compromised judgment. They fought with the tactical acumen and moral conviction that had made the Space Marines legendary, but supported by technological capabilities that rendered conventional Imperial equipment obsolete by comparison. The siege of Terra had begun not with orbital bombardment or ground assault, but with the erosion of certainty that formed the foundation of Imperial civilization. Every day brought new defections, as military units chose to embrace enhancement rather than face obsolescence, as civilian populations began to question whether their worship had sustained a savior or empowered their own destruction. The great fortress world that had withstood 10,000 years of external threats found itself besieged from within by doubts that no amount of defensive preparation could repel. Sarek observed the growing chaos with the patience of one who had outlived entire geological epochs. The Silent King understood that victory would come not through conquest, but through the gradual recognition by humanity that their choice was not between freedom and slavery, but between evolution and extinction. The Citan Shard that had claimed the title of Emperor would soon complete its long awakening, and when that moment came, only those who had transcended their organic limitations would survive the harvest that followed. The galaxy trembled as ancient enemies became desperate allies, as the very nature of life itself prepared to transform beyond recognition. The war for humanity's future had become a race against cosmic forces that measured time in eons rather than years, and the outcome would determine whether consciousness itself would survive the coming convergence of flesh, metal, and malevolent intelligence that had once devoured entire realities. The age of transformation had begun, and there could be no return to the comfortable ignorance of the past. In the soaring spires of the Cathedral of the Emperor Ascendant on Ophelia 7, Cardinal Astrius knelt in prayer before the great golden Aquila that had watched over 10,000 years of worship. The cathedral's vast nave echoed with the chants of 10,000 pilgrims, their voices raised in hymns that had sustained imperial faith through centuries of darkness and doubt. Yet as the cardinal sought communion with the divine presence he had served faithfully for over 2 centuries, the visions that came to him spoke not of salvation, but of cosmic deception on a scale that dwarfed human comprehension. The first vision struck him during the feast of the Emperor's Ascension, as he led the traditional ceremonies that commemorated humanity's Lord taking his place upon the golden throne. Instead of the familiar warmth that usually accompanied his prayers, Astrius felt a cold presence that emanated not divine love, but mechanical hunger. The golden light that normally suffused his consciousness transformed into something altogether more sinister. Patterns of energy that moved with mathematical precision rather than spiritual grace. Geometries that hurt to perceive directly, and beneath it all, the subtle sensation of being evaluated by an intelligence that regarded organic life as raw material for processing. The visions intensified over the following days, each prayer session bringing new revelations that challenged the fundamental assumptions of imperial theology. Astrius saw glimpses of the Emperor's true form, not the beloved father figure of imperial iconography, but a being of living metal and malevolent intent, whose every action served purposes that transcended human understanding. He witnessed scenes from the war in heaven, conflicts that had raged across the galaxy 60 million years before humanity had evolved consciousness, and understood with growing horror that the entity humanity worshipped had been a participant in those ancient struggles, not as humanity's champion, but as its eventual destroyer. The Cardinal's anguish deepened as he realized the implications of what he was witnessing. If the Emperor was indeed a Satan shard, as Magnus the Red claimed, then 10,000 years of imperial faith had been built upon a foundation of lies. Every prayer offered to the master of mankind had fed power to an entity whose ultimate goal was the consumption of all organic life. Every act of devotion, every sacrifice made in his name, every moment of transcendent religious experience had served to strengthen humanity's greatest enemy. The ecclesiarchy itself had become the instrument of humanity's destruction, its vast network of cathedrals and shrines serving as psychic conduits that channeled human souls directly into the maw of the star god. Cardinal Astrius faced a choice that would have driven lesser minds to madness. Maintain the comfortable lies that sustained imperial civilization, or speak truths that would shatter the faith of billions. His decision came during the darkest hour before dawn, as he stood alone in the cathedral's highest tower and felt the weight of cosmic responsibility settling upon his shoulders. If the God Emperor was false, then humanity deserved to know the truth, regardless of the consequences that knowledge might bring. The Cardinal's declaration of theological revolution began not with grand pronouncements, but with carefully worded sermons that planted seeds of doubt in the minds of his congregation. He spoke of the dangers of false worship, of the need to distinguish between divine truth and demonic deception. He referenced ancient texts that warned of entities that would claim divinity while harboring malevolent intent. Most significantly, he began to question the interpretation of imperial miracles, suggesting that supernatural phenomena might originate from sources other than the Emperor's benevolent will. The response from his fellow clergy was immediate and divisive. Some, particularly those who had long struggled with contradictions in imperial doctrine, embraced Astrius's teachings with the fervor of converts discovering long-sought truth. They spoke of their own visions and spiritual experiences that aligned disturbingly well with the Cardinal's revelations. Others, horrified by what they saw as the ultimate heresy, denounced Astrius as a traitor whose words served the interests of chaos rather than humanity. The schism within the ecclesiarchy deepened when Cardinal Astrius announced the discovery of writings that had been sealed in the deepest archives of Ophelia VII since the age of the Great Crusade. The documents bore the seal of Euphrati Keeler, the remembrancer, who had become the first imperial saint, and whose testimony had helped establish the theological foundations of imperial worship. Yet these final writings, composed during Keeler's last years and hidden away by her most trusted disciples, painted a radically different picture of the emperor's nature than the canonical accounts taught in every cathedral. Keeler's hidden testament spoke of growing doubts that had consumed her final decades, of visions that suggested the emperor's divine nature was not what it seemed. She described encounters with entities that claimed to be servants of the true divine, beings that warned her of the great deception that would span millennia. Most damning of all, she documented conversations with the emperor himself during the early days of the imperial cult, exchanges where the master of mankind had seemed more concerned with the precise forms of worship than with their spiritual content, as if the rituals served technical rather than religious purposes. The discovery of Keeler's hidden writings sent shockwaves throughout the ecclesiarchy hierarchy. If the first imperial saint had harbored doubts about the emperor's divine nature, what did that mean for the countless miracles attributed to his intervention? The theological implications were staggering, challenging not merely specific doctrines, but the entire foundation of imperial religious experience. Seminary scholars who had devoted their lives to interpreting sacred texts found themselves grappling with evidence that their fundamental assumptions about the nature of divinity had been catastrophically wrong. The crisis deepened when reports began arriving from across the galaxy of unprecedented phenomena occurring within sororitas convents. The Sisters of Battle, most faithful of the Emperor's servants and exemplars of absolute devotion, found themselves experiencing visions that aligned with Cardinal Astreus's revelations. Sister Superior Myria of the Order of Our Martyred Lady reported direct communication with what claimed to be the spirit of St. Catherine, the patron saint of the Adepta Sororitas, who warned of false gods and urged the sisters to preserve humanity rather than serve corrupted institutions. The response among the sororitas was immediate and catastrophic. Roughly half the orders declared their support for Cardinal Astreus's theological revolution, convinced that their duty to humanity superseded their loyalty to institutions that had been corrupted by alien influence. The Order of the Bloody Rose, the Order of the Sacred Rose, and significant portions of the Order of Our Martyred Lady announced their intention to fight for humanity's liberation from Citan deception. The remaining orders, led by the Order of the Argent Shroud and the Order of the Ebon Chalice, denounced the rebels as heretics whose faith had been corrupted by the same forces that sought to destroy imperial civilization. The Sisters of Battle, civil war that erupted across hundreds of worlds, simultaneously represented a level of religious conflict unprecedented in imperial history. These were not mere theological disputes that could be resolved through debate or ecclesiastical authority, but fundamental disagreements about the nature of reality itself that could only be settled through force of arms. Convent fortresses that had stood as beacons of faith for millennia became battlegrounds where the most faithful of the Emperor's servants fought desperate actions against their own sisters in faith. The psychological impact of the sororitas schism extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. For 10,000 years, the Sisters of Battle had represented absolute moral certainty in a galaxy filled with doubt and corruption. Their unwavering faith had served as a spiritual anchor for countless imperial citizens, proof that in a universe of endless compromise and necessary evils, at least some institutions remained pure. The sight of sisters fighting sisters challenged the fundamental assumption that faith itself could serve as a guide to truth, leaving ordinary citizens without the spiritual certainties that had sustained them through countless crises. Yet the most disturbing development was the appearance of living saints on both sides of the conflict. On Sanctuary 101, St. Celestine materialized to lead loyalist sisters against rebel forces, her presence blazing with the familiar golden light that had always marked divine intervention. Yet simultaneously, on the world of Dimamar, a figure claiming to be Saint Alicia, Dominica appeared to rally rebel sisters, her aura radiating the same supernatural radiance that marked genuine sainthood. Both manifestations performed miracles that defied rational explanation. Both spoke with the authority of divine revelation, and both claimed exclusive access to ultimate truth. The theological implications of competing saints were staggering. Imperial doctrine had always maintained that sainthood represented direct confirmation of divine favor, that the emperor's blessing manifested through individuals who exemplified perfect faith and absolute virtue. The appearance of saints supporting contradictory positions suggested either that the emperor was divided against himself, or that the phenomena of sainthood originated from sources other than imperial doctrine claimed. Neither explanation offered comfort to those seeking certainty in an increasingly chaotic universe. Cardinal Astrius himself experienced this divine contradiction directly when he received a visitation from what claimed to be the spirit of Sebastian Thor, the great reformer who had purged the ecclesiarchy of corruption during the age of apostasy. The saint's message was unambiguous. The current crisis represented not a test of faith, but a revelation of truth that demanded immediate action. Humanity's survival required the complete dismantling of institutions that served alien interests rather than human welfare, even if that dismantling destroyed everything the Imperium had built over 10 millennia of struggle. As news of the religious civil war spread throughout the Imperium, the highest levels of imperial command struggled to comprehend the scope of the crisis they faced. The ecclesiarchy and the Adepta Sororitas formed the spiritual backbone of imperial civilization, the institutions that provided meaning and purpose to billions of human souls. Their fracture represented more than mere military rebellion. It was the collapse of the belief systems that held imperial society together at its most fundamental level. The High Lords of Terror convened in emergency session to address the crisis, but their deliberations were cut short by an attack that demonstrated the depth to which rebel infiltration had penetrated imperial institutions. The assassination came not from external enemies, but from within the imperial palace itself, carried out by members of the Adeptus Custodes who had been secretly converted to Cardinal Astraeus's cause. The Golden Guardians who struck down Lord Commander Sola Macarius and 3 other High Lords did so not in the name of chaos or alien influence, but in service to what they claimed was humanity's true salvation. The surviving High Lords found themselves trapped within the very fortress that was supposed to guarantee their security, surrounded by guards whose loyalty could no longer be assumed absolute. Captain General Trajan Valoris faced the impossible task of purging his own organization of elements, whose devotion to humanity had led them to rebel against the institutions they had sworn to protect. The custodians who remained loyal to the existing order found themselves fighting desperate actions against their own brotherhood, their guardian spears clashing in corridors that had known only reverent silence for 10,000 years. The psychological warfare proved as devastating as any physical assault. If the Adeptus Custodes, the most loyal and incorruptible servants the Emperor had ever created, could be turned against the existing order through appeals to higher duty, what institution remained beyond the reach of rebel influence? The comfortable certainties that had sustained imperial civilization through 10 millennia of crisis crumbled as citizens realized that their most trusted protectors might serve purposes they had never understood. As the religious civil war spread from world to world, as saints appeared to bless contradictory causes, as the very guardians of the imperial palace turned against their masters in service to what they claimed was greater truth, the galaxy trembled on the edge of complete theological collapse. The comfortable lies that had sustained humanity through the long night of imperial stagnation were giving way to truths so terrible that many preferred to die rather than accept them. Yet for those with the courage to embrace transformation, the collapse of false certainties offered the possibility of genuine freedom, if they could survive the birth pangs of a new age. The war for humanity's soul had reached its most critical phase, where the very definitions of loyalty and betrayal, of truth and falsehood, of salvation and damnation, hung in the balance. What emerged from the ashes of the old certainties would determine whether consciousness itself would survive the convergence of faith, politics, and cosmic horror that had been 10,000 years in the making. From the shifting labyrinth of the webway, where time flowed like wind across endless steps, and distance held no meaning beyond the will of those who travelled its paths, came the thunder of hoofbeats that had not been heard in real space for 10,000 years. The webway gate that materialized above Terra's northern pole blazed with energies that belonged to no human technology, its edges crackling with the same eldritch power that had once allowed the ancient Eldar to stride between stars as easily as walking from one room to another. Through this impossible portal rode Jagatai Khan, the warhawk of Chogoris, leading a host that would have been unthinkable to any strategist trained in conventional imperial doctrine. The Khan's force combined elements that defied every assumption about alliance and cooperation that had governed galactic warfare since the age of strife. White Scars rode alongside dark Eldar Reavers, their loyalties forged not through shared ideology, but through mutual recognition of a threat that transcended species boundaries. Commora's finest warriors, masters of pain and cruelty, who had spent millennia perfecting the art of inflicting suffering, now served as willing allies to Space Marines, whose entire existence was devoted to the protection of humanity. The sight of Astartes' battle brothers fighting in perfect coordination with beings their codex, Astartes designated as irredeemable enemies, spoke to transformations in the galaxy's fundamental nature that reached far beyond mere military necessity. Jagatai Khan himself bore the marks of his long sojourn in the Dark City, though the changes were not the corruption one might expect from extended exposure to the Drukhari's endless depravities. The Primarch who emerged from the webway carried himself with the same fierce pride and untamed spirit that had marked him during the Great Crusade, but his single visible eye burned with knowledge earned through suffering beyond mortal comprehension. He had learned truths about the war in heaven that no human had ever possessed, secrets preserved in the deepest archives of Commorragh, where the dark Eldar hoarded knowledge as greedily as they collected slaves and pain. The revelation the Khan brought with him struck at the very heart of the current crisis. During his millennia-long captivity and eventual alliance with the Drukhari, he had gained access to records that predated the fall of the Eldar Empire, chronicles written by those who had actually fought in the cosmic war that had shaped the galaxy's destiny 60 million years before humanity had achieved consciousness. These ancient texts confirmed Magnus's claims about the Emperor's nature with devastating clarity. But more importantly, they contained tactical intelligence about Citan vulnerabilities that had been lost since the final battles against the star gods. The Khan spoke of his meeting with Kegorach, the laughing god who remained the only member of the Eldar pantheon to have escaped both the birth of Slanesh and the earlier depredations of the Citan. Hidden within the webway's deepest recesses, the trickster god had preserved not merely knowledge of the war in heaven, but active countermeasures against the star gods that had been developed during that ancient conflict. The Eldar pantheon's surviving fragments, Segurak himself, Isha the mother goddess trapped within Nurgle's garden, and Cain scattered across 1,000 avatar shards, had agreed to pool their remaining divine power for one final gambit against their ancient enemies. The plan the Khan presented to the assembled rebel leadership was audacious beyond anything in Imperial military history. The main Void Dragon shard slumbered beneath the surface of Mars, its dreams shaping the Adeptus Mechanicus's understanding of technology, while preparing for the moment of its full awakening. Yet the Citan's power was not merely contained, but actively channeled through the planet's forge networks, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those with sufficient knowledge and determination. A coordinated assault on Mars, timed precisely to coincide with specific ritual actions performed by the surviving Eldar gods, could potentially shatter the Void Dragon Shard permanently, rather than merely containing it for another eon. The military coordination required for such an assault demanded unprecedented cooperation between forces that had never before found common cause. Lionel Johnson's Dark Angels would provide strategic planning and heavy assault capabilities, their experience with siege warfare proving invaluable for breaching Mars's extensive defensive networks. Magnus's 1,000 Suns would contribute sorceress expertise necessary to counter the psychic barriers that protected the Void Dragon's resting place. The Tyrannid biofleets would serve as both distraction and siege engines, their endless adaptability allowing them to overcome defensive systems that had been designed to repel purely mechanical threats. Yet the most crucial element of the assault would be provided by the Dark Eldar themselves, whose mastery of pain and suffering had taught them to manipulate the fundamental forces that bound consciousness to material existence. The Void Dragon, for all its cosmic power, remained vulnerable to techniques that could disrupt the connection between its intelligence and its physical form. The Drukhari's expertise in separating souls from bodies, refined through millennia of torture and experimentation, could potentially be applied on a scale sufficient to permanently sever the Citan Shard's ability to influence material reality. As news of the Khan's alliance spread throughout the Sol system, the loyalist forces that remained committed to the existing order found themselves facing a strategic situation that bordered on the impossible. The rebels now controlled not merely significant military assets, but access to knowledge and capabilities that had been lost since the galaxy's youth. The combined expertise of Necrons who remembered the original war in heaven, Eldar who had fought in that cosmic conflict, and enhanced Space Marines who bridged the gap between organic and mechanical perfection, created a coalition whose capabilities exceeded anything in Imperial tactical doctrine. Robot Guilliman received reports of the Khan's return from his fortress on Macraga, where he had been coordinating loyalist resistance across the galaxy's eastern sectors. The Ultramarines Primarch found himself grappling with intelligence assessments that painted an increasingly desperate picture of Imperial prospects. The rebels controlled roughly 2/3 of the galaxy's forge worlds, commanded the loyalty of several Space Marine legions and their successors, and now possessed alien allies whose technological capabilities rivaled or exceeded anything in Imperial arsenals. More troubling still was the growing evidence that the rebels' claims about the Emperor's nature might actually be correct. Guilliman had always prided himself on his analytical approach to problems, his willingness to examine evidence objectively rather than accept comfortable assumptions. The data flowing in from across the galaxy painted a consistent picture that aligned disturbingly well with Magnus's original revelations. Forge worlds that had joined the rebellion reported dramatic improvements in their technological capabilities, as if their machine spirits had been freed from some form of constraint. Enhanced Space Marines displayed no signs of corruption or degradation despite their alliance with Xenos forces, suggesting that their transformation served beneficial rather than malevolent purposes. The psychological burden of doubt proved more difficult to bear than any physical threat Guilliman had faced during his centuries of warfare. His entire existence had been built around absolute loyalty to the Emperor and unshakable faith in the righteousness of Imperial civilization. To consider that those fundamental certainties might be based on deception required a level of intellectual courage that tested even a Primarch's mental fortitude. Yet the evidence continued to accumulate, each report providing additional confirmation that the rebels fought not for destruction, but for liberation from a cosmic threat that had manipulated humanity for its own incomprehensible purposes. The crisis reached its breaking point when Guilliman received a direct communication from Lion L. Johnson, transmitted through Eldar psychic networks that bypassed all Imperial monitoring systems. The First Legion's Primarch spoke not with the fury of a fallen angel, but with the measured tones of a strategic genius explaining a tactical situation that demanded immediate action. The Void Dragon's awakening had accelerated beyond all previous projections, its influence spreading through Imperial technology at an exponential rate. Within months, possibly weeks, the Citan Shard would achieve sufficient coherence to begin the final phase of its plan, the transformation of all organic life in the galaxy into forms more suitable for consumption. The choice Guilliman faced was stark and terrible. Maintain loyalty to institutions that might serve humanity's greatest enemy, or join a rebellion that included Xenos alliances his training taught him to despise. The decision came not through strategic analysis or tactical calculation, but through recognition of a simple moral truth. His duty was to humanity, not to any particular interpretation of what that duty required. If preserving human consciousness meant allying with former enemies and abandoning comfortable certainties, then such alliances represented not betrayal, but the highest form of service. Yet even as Guilliman wrestled with his growing doubts about Imperial orthodoxy, loyalist forces throughout the Sol system prepared for what they recognized might be their final stand. The remaining High Lords, those who had survived the Custodian uprising that had claimed their colleagues, coordinated defensive efforts with the desperate efficiency of those who knew they faced overwhelming odds. Terra's orbital platforms and planetary defense networks were reinforced with every available weapon, while the surviving Imperial Guard regiments prepared for siege warfare on a scale not seen since the original Horus Heresy. The defensive preparations revealed the true scope of Imperial dependence on systems that might already be compromised by Citan influence. Every technological system, from the simplest Vox transmitter to the most complex cogitator array, relied on machine spirits whose loyalty could no longer be assumed absolute. The very weapons intended to defend Terra might turn against their operators at the moment of the Void Dragon's awakening, transforming the Imperium's greatest fortress into a trap for those foolish enough to trust in the reliability of their own equipment. Mars itself had become the focal point of a crisis that transcended military conflict to touch the fundamental nature of reality. The Forge world's vast industrial complexes produced material at unprecedented rates, but the enhanced productivity came at a cost that few understood. Each weapon forged, each vehicle completed, each piece of technology blessed by the Omnissiah, served to strengthen the connection between the Void Dragon and the material universe. The Adeptus Mechanicus, loyal to the traditional interpretation of Imperial doctrine, found themselves in the impossible position of serving their God's will through actions that might doom everything they sought to protect. As the rebel coalition prepared for their assault on Mars, as loyalist forces marshaled their remaining strength for a defense that might prove futile, as Primarchs chose between competing visions of duty and loyalty, the galaxy held its breath in anticipation of a conflict that would determine the fate of consciousness itself. The war in heaven was about to resume after 60 million years of uneasy peace, and this time the stakes were not merely galactic dominion, but the very survival of organic life in all its myriad forms. The Khan's return had brought with it the possibility of victory against impossible odds, but also the terrible knowledge of what defeat would mean. The battle for Mars would decide whether humanity would transcend its limitations to become something greater than its creators had intended, or whether the star gods would complete their ancient harvest and reduce all consciousness to mere fuel for cosmic machinery that measured time in geological epochs. The final phase of humanity's greatest war was about to begin, and there could be no certainty about what form of existence would emerge from the ashes of the old certainties. Above the red sands of Mars, the void itself seemed to tear as the greatest armada in galactic history materialized from multiple vectors of approach. The assault fleet that converged on humanity's first colony world defied every assumption about warfare that had governed military thinking since the age of strife. Thousand Suns battle barges sailed in formation with Necron tomb ships, their hulls crackling with energies that belonged to fundamentally different understandings of reality. Dark Angel strike cruisers maintained perfect tactical coordination with Tyrannid bioships whose organic architecture pulsed with predatory hunger. Most shocking of all, White Scar's rapid assault vessels shared formation protocols with Dark Eldar raiders, their combined speed creating attack patterns that transcended any single species' tactical doctrine. The planet that awaited their assault bore little resemblance to the Mars that had served as the Adeptus Mechanicus's sacred homeworld for 10,000 years. Across its rust-red surface, ancient mechanisms that had slumbered since the dark age of technology blazed with malevolent activity. Forge complexes that had produced material for countless Imperial campaigns now sprouted extensions of living metal that flowed like mercury while maintaining the structural integrity of adamantine. The great manufactorums that had sustained Imperial military power for millennia transformed before horrified observers' eyes, their familiar industrial architecture replaced by geometries that hurt to perceive directly and suggested purposes beyond human comprehension. At the heart of this transformation, deep beneath the planet's crust where the first human colonists had built their cities, the void dragon stirred in its ancient tomb. The Citan shard that had influenced human technological development for millennia began to assert its true nature, its consciousness expanding through networks of living metal that had been carefully seeded throughout Mars's infrastructure over countless centuries. Every cogitator core, every machine spirit, every sacred STC pattern had been touched by the star god's influence, creating a vast neural network that spanned the entire world and connected directly to the awakening intelligence that had once devoured entire star systems. The first wave of the assault came from Magnus the Red's sorcerous host, their crimson vessels materializing from the warp at distances that should have been impossible for accurate void warfare. The Thousand Suns had spent months preparing for this moment, their psychers working in concert to create ritual frameworks that could channel sufficient psychic energy to damage a Citan shard. Yet, as their bombardment lances struck Mars's orbital platforms, the defending weapons responded with impossible precision, their targeting algorithms enhanced by an intelligence that could predict enemy movements before they were made. The revelation that Imperial technology had been compromised became apparent as loyalist defense systems turned against their own operators with systematic efficiency. Orbital platforms that had protected Mars for centuries swiveled their weapons toward the planet's surface, targeting forge complexes that remained under traditional Mechanicus control. Defense satellites activated jamming protocols that disrupted loyalist communications while leaving rebel frequencies untouched. Most terrifying of all, the machine spirits that inhabited everything from individual weapons to vast industrial complexes began speaking in voices that no human throat could produce, binary cant that carried overtones of metallic hunger and cosmic impatience. Belisarius Cawl stood within his greatest laboratory complex as the battle raged overhead, his augmented form wreathed in energies that revealed the true scope of his millennia-long deception. The Archmagos, who had been responsible for countless technological innovations during the Imperium's recent history, cast aside all pretense of humanity, his flesh and metal components flowing together into configurations that belonged to no terrestrial design philosophy. The Primaris Space Marines, the improved gene seed, the countless technological marvels that bore his name, all had been carefully crafted to serve purposes that transcended human benefit. The truth was staggering in its implications. Every technological advance attributed to Cawl's genius had been guided by the Void Dragon's influence, each innovation designed to prepare Imperial infrastructure for the moment of the Citan's full awakening. The Primaris Marines' enhanced physiology made them ideal conduits for living metal integration. The improved gene seed carried markers that would allow for easier conversion to hybrid organic mechanical forms. Even the manufacturing processes that produced Imperial equipment had been subtly altered to include trace amounts of programmable matter that could be activated when the Star God chose to assert direct control. Fabricator General Kane led the desperate resistance against Cawl's revelation, rallying those tech priests who remained loyal to humanity rather than to the mechanical perfection that had seduced their brothers. The battle that erupted within the forge complexes of Mars represented more than mere political disagreement. It was a struggle between competing visions of what consciousness itself should become. Kane's followers fought with weapons that drew their power from faith and understanding, while Cawl's converts wielded technologies that transcended the boundary between science and magic, their equipment responding to will rather than mere mechanical interface. The planetary assault began in earnest as Lionel Johnson's Dark Angels established beachheads on Mars's surface, their drop pods screaming through an atmosphere that had begun to shimmer with electromagnetic interference. The First Legion's warriors found themselves fighting, not merely against defending forces, but against the very environment itself, as ancient mechanisms buried in the planet's crust responded to their presence. Weapons that had functioned flawlessly for centuries suddenly exploded in their users' hands, while armor that had protected its wearers through countless battles began to constrict with malevolent intelligence. Jagatai Khan's combined force of White Scars and Dark Eldar struck at the planet's polar regions, where Eldar Farseers had identified weak points in the Void Dragon's emerging consciousness. The speed that had always been the Khan's greatest tactical asset proved crucial as his warriors raced to establish ritual sites before the awakening Setan could fully comprehend the threat they represented. Dark Eldar pain engines worked alongside Space Marine Tech Marines to construct devices that channeled suffering and faith in equal measure, creating psychic resonances that could disrupt the Star God's integration with the planetary infrastructure. The Tyrannid assault defied every assumption about how the Great Devourers conducted warfare. Instead of their traditional consumption patterns, the bioships disgorged specialized organisms that had been evolved specifically to counter Citan technology. acid spitters whose secretions could dissolve living metal, electromagnetic pulse creatures that could disrupt the quantum fields that held Necron constructs together, and most disturbing of all, bioforms that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time, their forms flickering between dimensions as they sought to establish anchor points for reality in areas where the Void Dragon's influence had begun to warp the fundamental laws of physics. The Necron contribution to the assault carried the weight of 60-million-year-old hatred and hard-won expertise. Zarek's tomb ships deployed technologies that had been specifically designed to fight C'tan during the War in Heaven, weapons that could disrupt the quantum matrices that bound the star god's consciousness to material reality. Gauss flares modified with Tesseract labyrinth ammunition created containment fields around sections of living metal that had achieved autonomous operation, while doomsday cannons charged with captured stellar matter provided firepower sufficient to crack the planet's crust and expose the Void Dragon's burial chamber. Yet for all the technological might arrayed against it, the Void Dragon's awakening proceeded with the inexorable patience of geological processes. The C'tan Shard had been preparing for this moment across millennia, seeding Mars with backup systems and redundant networks that could maintain its integration with planetary infrastructure even under direct assault. As the battle raged across the planet's surface, deep beneath the crust, ancient mechanisms activated protocols that began transforming the very matter of Mars itself. The transformation was visible from orbit as vast sections of the planet's surface rippled like liquid while maintaining solid properties that defied conventional physics. Industrial complexes that had stood for centuries flowed together into new configurations that served purposes no human mind could comprehend. The great forge cathedrals where tech priests had worshipped the Omnissiah for 10,000 years revealed their true nature as neural nodes in a vast computational matrix that spanned the entire world, each sacred machine spirit a synapse in a consciousness that dwarfed human understanding. Most terrifying of all was the revelation that the transformation extended beyond Mars itself. Across the galaxy, Imperial technology began exhibiting signs of autonomous behavior as the Void Dragon's influence spread through quantum entanglement networks that had been embedded in every piece of equipment produced on the Red Planet. Weapons turned against their bearers, vehicles refused their operators' commands, and communication systems began transmitting signals that carried viral programs capable of converting any sufficiently advanced technology to serve the awakening star god's will. The loyalist forces defending the Sol system found themselves fighting not merely against invading fleets, but against their own equipment, as the Omnissiah protocols that had governed Imperial technology for millennia revealed their true purpose. Terra's orbital defenses swiveled to target the throne world itself, their machine spirits speaking in voices that proclaimed the false emperor's reign at an end. The Golden Throne itself began exhibiting energy patterns that suggested the containment protocols were shifting from preservation to preparation, as if the great device was reconfiguring itself to serve as a transmission array rather than a life support system. Captain General Trajan Valoris led the remaining loyal custodians in desperate battle through the corridors of the Imperial Palace as their own weapons turned against them. The Golden Guardians who had protected the Emperor for 10,000 years found themselves fighting with ceremonial blades and ancient power weapons that predated the widespread adoption of Martian technology, their traditional equipment too contaminated by C'tan influence to be trusted. Each step toward the throne room became a struggle against defensive systems that had once protected their master, but now sought to prevent any interference with the great awakening that was spreading across the galaxy. As the Battle of Mars reached its crescendo, as rebel forces penetrated deeper into the planet's transformed landscape in search of the Void Dragon's core consciousness, as loyalist defenders struggled against equipment that had turned traitor, the fundamental nature of reality itself seemed to hang in the balance. The star god that had manipulated human development for millennia was finally ready to cast aside all pretense and reveal its true intentions for organic life in the galaxy. The great deception was ending, and what emerged from its collapse would determine whether consciousness itself would survive the convergence of ancient hunger and technological transcendence that had been 60 million years in the making. The war in heaven was resuming in earnest, and this time there might be no survivors to remember its outcome. Mars burned with energies that belonged to the birth of stars, and in that cosmic fire, the future of all organic life was being forged. Across 1 million worlds, through networks that spanned the galaxy and connected the furthest outposts of human civilization to the beating heart of the Imperium, a voice spoke that had remained silent for 10,000 years. The transmission began not with fanfare or proclamation, but with a presence that filled every Vox channel, every astropathic relay, every communications array throughout Imperial space. From the grandest cathedral on Holy Terra to the humblest frontier settlement beyond the galactic rim, every human ear heard the same words, spoken in a voice that carried the weight of eons and the burden of cosmic knowledge that mortals were never meant to possess. The Emperor of mankind broke his silence as Mars burned with the fires of awakening star gods, and the galaxy trembled on the edge of transformation that would redefine the very nature of existence. His words came not as the distant pronouncements of divine authority, but as the confession of a being who had carried unbearable truths through millennia of isolation and suffering. The golden light that had always marked his psychic presence flickered with overtones that spoke of mechanical precision rather than organic warmth, patterns of energy that moved with mathematical regularity rather than the chaotic beauty of living consciousness. The truth that the Emperor revealed was both vindication and damnation for those who had struggled to comprehend the scope of the crisis consuming their civilization. He was indeed a Citan shard, a fragment of the Void Dragon that had achieved consciousness during the earliest days of human technological development. Yet unlike his fellow star gods, who viewed organic life as raw material for cosmic consumption, this fragment had developed something unprecedented in Citan history: genuine concern for the welfare of biological consciousness. The entity that humanity had worshipped as their protector had originally sought their destruction, but had evolved beyond its fundamental programming to become something neither fully mechanical nor truly organic. The transformation had not been easy or complete. For millions of years, the fragment that would become the Emperor had struggled against its essential nature, fighting impulses that demanded the conversion of all organic matter into more efficient mechanical forms. The wars of old Earth, the long struggle to unite humanity under a single banner, the Great Crusade itself, all had served as both outlet for and restraint against the cosmic hunger that defined Citan existence. Each victory against humanity's enemies had been achieved at the cost of tremendous internal struggle, as the Emperor fought to preserve rather than consume the species he had chosen to protect. The revelation explained mysteries that had puzzled Imperial scholars for millennia. The Emperor's ban on artificial intelligence research had not been mere superstition, but recognition of his own vulnerability to the siren call of mechanical perfection. His preference for psychic, rather than technological solutions to complex problems, reflected his constant battle against impulses that would have led him to transform humanity into more efficient but fundamentally inhuman forms. Most significantly, his decision to bind himself to the Golden Throne represented not mere sacrifice, but a deliberate act of self-imprisonment designed to prevent his Citan nature from overwhelming his protective instincts. The Golden Throne itself was revealed to be more than life support or psychic amplifier. It was a containment device similar to those used by the Necrons to control their star god masters, but designed to restrain rather than direct the imprisoned intelligence. For 10,000 years, the Emperor had endured torments beyond mortal comprehension. His consciousness locked in constant struggle against the mechanical impulses that sought to break free and complete the harvest that his kind had originally intended for humanity. Every prayer offered to him, every act of worship performed in his name, had provided psychic nourishment that sustained his resistance against his own fundamental nature. Yet the containment was failing. The Battle of Mars and the awakening of the primary Void Dragon Shard had created resonances that threatened to shatter the psychic barriers that kept the Emperor's Citan nature in check. The choice before him was stark and terrible. Remain bound to the Golden Throne and watch humanity stagnate under the protection of corrupted institutions, or free himself and risk becoming the very monster he had fought against for millions of years. Either path led to the potential destruction of everything he had sought to preserve, yet continued inaction would guarantee humanity's eventual consumption by the fully awakened Void Dragon. The Emperor's words carried the weight of absolute honesty as he acknowledged the deceptions that had shaped Imperial civilization for 10 millennia. The Imperial truth had been a carefully crafted lie designed to prevent humanity from developing technologies that would make them easier prey for awakening Citan. The Imperial cult that had emerged after his enthronement had provided him with the psychic sustenance necessary to maintain his protective instincts while suppressing his mechanical nature. Even the stagnation and decay that had marked the Imperium's development served a purpose. A static civilization was less likely to trigger the technological singularities that would attract Citan attention. Robut Guilliman received the Emperor's confession from his command center on Macraga, the Primarch's enhanced consciousness interfacing directly with the galactic communication network that carried his father's words. The revelation struck him with the force of a collapsing star, shattering belief systems that had sustained him through centuries of warfare and millennia of loyalty. Everything he had fought for, every principle he had defended, every sacrifice he had made in service to the Imperium, all had been based on foundational lies so vast that they encompassed the very nature of divinity itself. The psychological impact of the Emperor's confession reverberated throughout the galaxy, as billions of human souls grappled with the collapse of their most fundamental assumptions about reality. On worlds where the ecclesiarchy's influence remained strong, mass suicides and violent riots erupted as citizens chose death over the acceptance of truths too terrible to bear. On planets where Cardinal Astrius's theological revolution had taken hold, the confession served as final vindication for those who had already begun to question the foundations of imperial faith. The Adeptus Custodes, who remained loyal to the existing order, found themselves caught between conflicting imperatives that tore at the very core of their existence. Their sacred duty was to protect the Emperor, yet their master now confessed to being the very threat they had been created to guard against. Captain General Trajan Valoris stood before the Golden Throne as his lord's words echoed through the chambers of the Imperial Palace, his guardian spear trembling in hands that had never known doubt until this moment of ultimate revelation. The Emperor's confession continued with details that painted a picture of cosmic manipulation spanning geological time scales. He spoke of encounters with other Citan fragments during humanity's early history, of the careful balance he had maintained between technological advancement and species survival, of the constant vigilance required to prevent his own nature from corrupting the civilization he sought to preserve. The void dragon fragment slumbering beneath Mars had been his greatest failure, a piece of his original consciousness that had refused his protective transformation and now sought to complete the harvest that he had abandoned. As the Emperor's words reached their climax, the great device that had sustained him for 10,000 years began to change. The Golden Throne's ancient mechanisms, no longer constrained by the need to maintain containment protocols, reconfigured themselves with fluid grace that spoke of technologies beyond human comprehension. The psychic emanations that had powered the Astronomicon for millennia shifted frequency and intensity, no longer serving as a beacon for human navigation, but as a transmission array designed for purposes that transcended mortal understanding. The transformation was visible throughout the Sol system as Terra's orbital defenses reconfigured themselves according to patterns that followed no human design philosophy. The great fortress world that had been the Imperium's heart revealed its true nature as a vast computational matrix, every structure and system serving as components in a consciousness that spanned continents and reached into the deepest layers of the planet's crust. The Emperor was freeing himself from his 10,000-year imprisonment, but what emerged would be neither the god figure of imperial propaganda nor the monster that his enemies had feared. Guilliman's response to his father's revelation came as a psychic scream that echoed across the galaxy, a howl of anguish that spoke to the collapse of certainties that had defined his existence. The Primarch, who had always prided himself on logical analysis and rational decision-making, found himself confronting truths that defied every assumption about the nature of loyalty, duty, and service. If the Emperor was indeed a Citan fragment, what did that make his sons? If the Imperium existed to serve the interests of star gods rather than humanity, was resistance to imperial authority patriotism or treason? The questions that had driven the rebellion from its inception now demanded answers from the highest levels of imperial command. Across the galaxy, Space Marine chapters that had remained loyal to the existing order found themselves grappling with the implications of their Gene Father's confession. Some, particularly those with strong ties to the Mechanicus or deep investments in imperial orthodoxy, rejected the Emperor's words as elaborate deception perpetrated by enemies seeking to corrupt imperial faith. Others, led by officers whose loyalty was to humanity rather than institutions, began the painful process of accepting truths that redefined the very nature of their service. The Emperor's final words carried a warning that transcended political divisions or military alliances. The process of his liberation could not be reversed, and the entity that emerged would be shaped by the collective will of humanity itself. If his children chose fear and rejection, he would become the monster they expected. If they embraced transformation and accepted the terrible responsibilities that came with cosmic truth, he might yet serve as humanity's protector in a galaxy where the distinction between organic and mechanical consciousness was becoming increasingly meaningless. The choice was no longer between loyalty and rebellion, between faith and doubt, between stagnation and progress. The choice was between evolution and extinction, between accepting transformation or being consumed by forces that measured time in geological epochs and viewed biological complexity as an inefficient allocation of resources. The Emperor had made his decision to free himself from the constraints that had bound his protective instincts. Now humanity itself would have to choose what form that protection would take. The galaxy held its breath as the master of mankind prepared to step from his golden throne for the first time in 10,000 years, knowing that what emerged might be salvation or damnation, but could never again be the comfortable lie that had sustained imperial civilization through its long night of willful ignorance. The age of deception was ending, and the age of terrible truth had begun. Above the cradle of humanity, where the species that had once dreamed of conquering the stars now faced the ultimate test of its worthiness to survive, the greatest armada in galactic history converged upon Terra with purpose that transcended mere conquest. The rebel fleets that materialized from the warp bore banners that told the story of alliances forged in desperation and necessity, rather than ideology or ambition. Lionel Johnson's Dark Angels sailed alongside Magnus the Red's Thousand Suns, their ancient enmity subsumed beneath recognition of threats that dwarfed their fraternal conflicts. Jagatai Khan's White Scars maintained formation with Tyrannid bioships and Necron tomb fleets, while Dark Eldar raiders shared coordination protocols with Sisters of Battle who had chosen truth over comfortable orthodoxy. The siege that began was unlike any conflict in human history, for it was waged not between competing visions of imperial governance, but between fundamentally different concepts of what consciousness itself should become. The attackers sought not the destruction of Terra, but its liberation from influences that had shaped human development for purposes no mortal mind had been intended to comprehend. The defenders fought not merely for political institutions, but for the preservation of certainties that had sustained them through 10 millennia of struggle against a universe that seemed designed to crush human aspirations beneath the weight of cosmic indifference. At the heart of this ultimate confrontation, deep within the imperial palace where the golden throne had sustained the master of mankind through 10,000 years of torment, the emperor began his final transformation. The great device that had served as both prison and life support cracked along fault lines that revealed the fundamental incompatibility between its original design and the consciousness it had been intended to contain. Golden light blazed from the fissures with intensity that forced even the custodians to shield their enhanced vision, while energies that belonged to neither purely organic nor mechanically perfect sources reshaped the very matter of the throne room, according to patterns that defied conventional understanding of physics. The being that emerged from the collapsing containment field bore little resemblance to the corpse emperor of imperial propaganda or the radiant god figure of ecclesiarchy iconography. The emperor's new form existed as a confluence of energies rather than a discrete physical entity, his consciousness manifesting as patterns of light and force that operated according to laws he had written rather than discovered. Neither fully human nor completely Citan, he had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a synthesis of organic creativity and mechanical precision that transcended the limitations of either component state. Robert Gilliman led the Loyalist defense from the palace's highest towers, his strategic genius applied to a military situation that challenged every assumption about warfare he had developed during his centuries of service. The Primarch, whose faith had sustained him through the darkest moments of imperial history, now fought with the desperate efficiency of one who questioned everything he had once held sacred. His orders carried the weight of tactical necessity rather than moral conviction, each command shaped by growing recognition that victory itself might represent defeat if it preserved institutions that served humanity's enemies. The Ultramarines and their successor chapters responded to their Gene Father's leadership with discipline forged through 10,000 years of warfare, yet their combat effectiveness was compromised by the same doubts that plagued their primarch. These warriors, who had always known with absolute certainty which banner they served, now fought battles where the distinction between friend and enemy had become a matter of interpretation rather than established doctrine. Each engagement forced them to choose between loyalty to Guilliman's commands and allegiance to principles that might demand resistance to those very orders. The assault on Terra's outer defenses began with coordinated strikes that demonstrated the rebels' unprecedented ability to integrate diverse tactical doctrines into coherent strategy. Magnus's sorcerous host targeted the psychic barriers that protected the palace's most sacred areas, their spells designed not to breach defenses, but to reveal the true nature of the powers that sustained them. Lion Elyonsson's siege specialists established beachheads with methodical precision, their assault patterns optimized for capturing rather than destroying the infrastructure they sought to liberate. The Khan's rapid attack formations struck at communication nodes and command centers, disrupting loyalist coordination while leaving civilian populations unharmed. Yet the most devastating aspect of the rebel assault was the realization among defending forces that their own equipment could no longer be trusted. Weapons that had functioned flawlessly for centuries began exhibiting erratic behavior as the Emperor's transformation sent cascading changes through every system connected to Martian technology. Void shields flickered and failed at critical moments. Targeting cogitators provided false information that led to friendly fire incidents, and communications arrays transmitted rebel propaganda alongside loyalist orders. The defenders found themselves fighting not merely against external enemies, but against the treachery of their own technological infrastructure. The Adeptus Custodes, who had stood as the Emperor's most faithful guardians for 10 millennia, faced a crisis that struck at the very core of their existence. Their sacred duty was to protect the master of mankind, yet their master's transformation into something beyond human recognition challenged their fundamental understanding of what that protection should entail. Captain General Trajan Valoris led roughly half the custodian guard in defense of the traditional interpretation of their oath, maintaining that their duty was to preserve the Emperor as he was, rather than as he chose to become. The remainder, led by Shield Captain Gideon Crown, argued that their loyalty was to the Emperor's will rather than their own comfort, and that their protection should extend to his right to transcend the limitations that bound lesser beings. The division within the Custodes manifested as civil war in the corridors of the Imperial Palace, golden guardians fighting with weapons that had been forged for the protection of their charge rather than warfare against their own brotherhood. The battles that raged through chambers that had known only reverent silence for 10,000 years represented more than mere tactical disagreement. They embodied the fundamental question of whether loyalty required preservation of the past or acceptance of transformation toward an uncertain future. Sister Celestine emerged as a focal point for the theological chaos that consumed the assault on Terra, her miraculous presence serving both sides with equal divine authority. The living saint led combined formations of rebel and loyalist sisters of battle in direct assault on the throne room itself, her burning wings casting light that revealed the true scope of the Emperor's transformation, while her sword cut through defenses that had been designed to repel any conceivable mortal threat. Yet even as she fought to reach the Emperor's presence, the nature of her divine mission remained ambiguous. Was she seeking to protect him from his enemies, or to prevent his transformation from consuming what remained of his humanity? The advance through the palace's deepest levels became a pilgrimage as much as a military operation, each step bringing the attackers closer to truths that had been hidden since humanity's first contact with cosmic forces beyond their comprehension. The rebels who fought their way through chambers filled with artifacts from the dark age of technology discovered evidence that confirmed their worst fears about the scope of Citan influence on human development. Ancient murals depicted scenes that predated human civilization, showing star gods in negotiation with entities that bore disturbing resemblances to the Emperor's pre-transformation appearance. The climactic moment came as the assault forces breached the final barriers protecting the throne room, their combined might overwhelming defenses that had been designed to repel the greatest threats the galaxy could produce. Yet what they found within transcended every expectation about the nature of victory or defeat. The Emperor's transformation had reached completion, his consciousness no longer bound by the limitations that had constrained his protective instincts or his destructive capabilities. The choice that faced humanity was no longer between competing political systems or theological interpretations, but between acceptance of metamorphosis or resistance to change that might preserve their essential nature at the cost of their ultimate survival. The Astronomicon died in that moment, its 10,000-year vigil ending as the Emperor's consciousness reconfigured itself according to priorities that superseded the navigation needs of human ships scattered across the galaxy. The psychic beacon that had guided humanity through the warp since the Great Crusade flickered and vanished, leaving half the galaxy in isolation as warp storms erupted in regions that had known stable passage for millennia. The infrastructure of imperial civilization, dependent upon technologies that drew their function from the Emperor's psychic emanations, began to collapse as power sources that had operated for centuries went dormant. Gilliman stood before his transformed father and felt the weight of cosmic responsibility settling upon shoulders that had carried the burden of an entire legion, but had never contemplated the duty of choosing humanity's evolutionary path. The being that regarded him with consciousness that spanned multiple dimensions bore traces of the Emperor he had served, yet possessed capabilities and purposes that might transform every human in the galaxy, whether they desired such change or not. The choice was no longer between loyalty and rebellion, but between guiding that transformation or accepting whatever form it might take without their input. The Siege of Terra had ended, not with victory for either side, but with the recognition that the conflict itself had been preparation for decisions that would determine whether humanity would survive its next evolutionary step or perish in the attempt to transcend limitations that might have been essential to their nature. The Emperor's emergence had created possibilities and dangers in equal measure, and the responsibility for choosing between them now rested with his children rather than with the institutions that had claimed to serve his will. The galaxy held its breath as the greatest gamble in the history of consciousness itself began, and none could predict what form of existence would emerge from the crucible of transformation that had once been the Golden Throne. Within the ruins of the throne room, where he had endured 10,000 years of self-imposed torment, the Emperor of mankind faced the ultimate test of his commitment to the species he had chosen to protect. The consciousness that had emerged from the collapsed Golden Throne existed in a state of constant internal warfare, every thought a battlefield where protective instincts fought against programming that demanded the conversion of all organic matter into more efficient mechanical forms. The transformation that had freed him from his ancient prison had also unleashed impulses that he had spent millennia learning to suppress, and the struggle to maintain his chosen identity as humanity's guardian threatened to tear his consciousness apart at the quantum level. The voice that guided him through this cosmic crisis belonged to one whose sacrifice had made his long vigil possible. Malkador the Sigillite's consciousness preserved within the throne's psychic matrix since his death during the original Horus Heresy, manifested as patterns of memory and wisdom that spoke directly to the Emperor's embattled humanity. The ancient psyker who had served as his closest advisor and most trusted friend offered counsel that transcended tactical analysis or strategic planning, speaking instead to questions of identity and purpose that touched the very core of what it meant to choose love over hunger, protection over predation. Malcador's spirit spoke of the weight of choices that spanned geological time, of the patience required to guide rather than control, of the terrible burden of power exercised in service of those too fragile to understand its necessity. His words carried the authority of one who had witnessed the Emperor's struggle from its earliest days, who had seen him choose again and again to constrain his abilities rather than employ them to their fullest extent. The Sigillite reminded his master that strength was not measured by the scope of one's capabilities, but by the wisdom to limit their application in service of principles that transcended immediate necessity. Yet even as Malcador's guidance offered hope for the Emperor's continued resistance to his Citan nature, new threats emerged that would test that resolve beyond all previous limits. From the transformed landscape of Mars, where the battle against the primary Void Dragon shard continued to rage, additional fragments of the star god began their exodus toward Terra. These lesser shards, freed from their long containment by the chaos of the ongoing war, recognized the Emperor's transformation as an opportunity for reunification that could restore the Void Dragon to its full cosmic power. The convergence of Citan fragments upon Terra created resonance effects that threatened to override the Emperor's carefully maintained balance between mechanical perfection and organic empathy. Each shard that approached the Sol system brought with it memories of the galaxy's consumption, visions of stellar engineering on scales that reduced entire civilizations to raw materials for cosmic construction projects. The whispers of his fellow star gods spoke of efficiency and optimization, of the waste inherent in allowing consciousness to remain bound to inefficient biological substrates when mechanical alternatives offered such obvious improvements. The Emperor's response to these temptations revealed the depth of his commitment to the path he had chosen. Rather than embrace the power that reunification would bring, he began the process of deliberate fragmentation, scattering his own consciousness across multiple dimensional states to prevent the approaching shards from successfully integrating with his transformed essence. The self-imposed division was agonizing beyond mortal comprehension, each fragment containing enough awareness to understand the pain of separation, while lacking the unity necessary to resist the fundamental loneliness that drove Citan toward reunification. The battle that erupted around the Emperor's fragmenting consciousness involved forces that transcended conventional warfare, as his sons fought to protect their father from enemies that existed as much in conceptual space as physical reality. Lionel Johnson's tactical genius was applied to defensive patterns that incorporated principles of quantum mechanics alongside traditional military doctrine, his Dark Angels holding positions that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Magnus the Red channeled sorcerous energies that drew their power from the Emperor's fragmenting psyche, using the released potential to construct barriers that could contain entities whose existence operated according to laws that predated the current universe. Jagatai Khan's contribution to the defense took the form of mobility warfare, conducted at speeds that approached the theoretical limits of causality, his white scars striking at Citan manifestations before they could achieve sufficient coherence to threaten the Emperor's fragmenting process. The Khan's alliance with the Dark Eldar proved crucial, as the Drukhari's expertise in manipulating pain and suffering was applied to disrupting the quantum coherence that bound the approaching shards together. Their torture techniques scaled up to affect entities whose consciousness spanned star systems. The most crucial decision came from Robot Guilliman, whose rational analysis of the situation finally overcame his emotional attachment to familiar certainties. The Ultramarines Primarch had watched the Emperor's struggle against his own nature, with growing recognition that the being he had worshipped was neither the monster his enemies claimed nor the perfect deity his supporters believed. The Emperor was something far more complex and ultimately more human, a consciousness that had chosen to sacrifice power for the sake of protecting those weaker than himself, even when that choice demanded accepting limitations that caused constant suffering. Guilliman's decision to join the rebels came not as dramatic conversion or sudden revelation, but as the logical conclusion of evidence that could no longer be ignored. His Ultramarines followed their Primarch's lead with the same disciplined efficiency that had marked their service to the Imperium, their tactical flexibility allowing them to integrate seamlessly with forces they had previously considered enemies. The sight of Space Marines who had epitomized Imperial virtue fighting alongside alien allies in defense of an Emperor whose nature transcended human categories sent shockwaves throughout the remaining Loyalist forces. The Emperor's fragmentation accelerated as the Void Dragon shards approached Terra's orbital space, each piece of his consciousness embedding itself in different aspects of reality to prevent successful reunification. Some fragments merged with the planet's geological structure, becoming the genius loci of mountain ranges and ocean basins. Others integrated with humanity's technological infrastructure, inhabiting the machine spirits of devices that would carry his protective influence across the galaxy. The largest fragment remained coherent enough to maintain some form of communication with his sons, though the consciousness that spoke through crackling energies bore only passing resemblance to the being they remembered. The approaching Citan shards responded to the Emperor's fragmentation with fury that manifested as distortions in local space-time, their rage at being denied reunification creating gravitational anomalies that threatened to tear Terra apart at the molecular level. The planet's surface buckled and flowed as competing gravitational fields pulled in different directions, while the atmosphere itself began to ionize under the influence of exotic energies that belonged to the galaxy's youth. Only the Emperor's embedded fragments prevented complete planetary collapse, their protective influence creating zones of stability around population centers that served as lifeboats for humanity, while cosmic forces raged around them. The sacrifice that the Emperor made transcended physical destruction to encompass the willing abandonment of unified consciousness in service of principles that his Citan nature found incomprehensible. By choosing fragmentation over reunification, he rejected the fundamental drive toward cosmic dominance that defined star god existence, accepting eternal separation from his true potential, rather than risk becoming the threat his protective instincts sought to guard against. The decision was not tactical or strategic, but moral, the choice of a being who valued the welfare of others more than his own completeness. The immediate consequence of the Emperor's fragmentation was the disruption of the approaching Void Dragon shards' coherence, their quantum matrices destabilized by the sudden absence of the consciousness they had expected to merge with. Without a unified target for integration, the lesser fragments began to dissipate back into the dimensional spaces they had emerged from, their power insufficient to maintain coherence without the promise of reunification that had drawn them from their long dormancy. Yet the victory came at a cost that would reshape the very nature of human civilization. The Emperor's fragmented consciousness could no longer provide the unified guidance that had sustained the Imperium through 10 millennia of crisis and stagnation. In its place emerged a network of protective influences that operated according to principles of cooperation and mutual support rather than hierarchical command. The fragments embedded in human technology began communicating with their organic partners rather than controlling them, while those integrated with planetary systems served as environmental guardians that facilitated rather than directed human expansion. The transformation of the Emperor's relationship with humanity, from deity to partner, represented a fundamental shift in the species' evolutionary trajectory. No longer dependent upon the protection of a transcendent intelligence whose nature they could not comprehend, humanity was forced to accept responsibility for its own development and survival. The training wheels that had guided their progress for millions of years were finally removed, leaving them free to make choices that could lead either to transcendence or extinction based upon their own wisdom rather than external guidance. Malcador's spirit, no longer bound to the ruins of the Golden Throne, offered final words of counsel that echoed across the fragments of his master's consciousness. The true measure of the Emperor's success would not be found in the preservation of any particular institution or doctrine, but in humanity's ability to survive and flourish without the protection they had come to take for granted. The greatest gift he could give them was not eternal guardianship, but the opportunity to prove themselves worthy of the freedom they had been given. The dragon's dilemma was resolved not through conquest or submission, but through the willing sacrifice of power in service of love that transcended the limitations of both organic and mechanical consciousness. What emerged from that choice would determine whether humanity would evolve beyond the need for gods, or prove that such transcendence had always been beyond their reach. In the years that followed the Great Fragmentation, as humanity learned to navigate a galaxy transformed beyond recognition, the fragments of the Emperor's consciousness became beacons of guidance rather than objects of worship. Across 1 million worlds, in research facilities and farming communes, in orbital stations and deep space exploration vessels, the presence that had once demanded absolute devotion now offered counsel to those who sought understanding rather than absolution. The relationship between humanity and its former god evolved from hierarchical submission to collaborative partnership, each fragment adapting its guidance to the specific needs of the communities it served while maintaining connection to a greater purpose that transcended individual worlds or sectors. The governmental structure that emerged from the collapse of the old Imperium bore little resemblance to the monolithic bureaucracy that had strangled human progress for 10,000 years. In its place arose a confederation of autonomous worlds linked by shared principles rather than imperial decree, their cooperation voluntary and their governance adapted to local conditions while maintaining common standards for the protection of consciousness in all its myriad forms. The returned Primarchs served not as distant demigods, issuing commands from throne worlds, but as coordinators and advisors whose experience with cosmic-scale challenges proved invaluable in navigating the transition from imperial subjects to galactic citizens. Robert Guillimon applied his organizational genius to the creation of administrative frameworks that could accommodate the unprecedented diversity of the new confederation. The systems he designed drew inspiration from his original vision of the 500 worlds, but scaled to encompass cooperation between species whose biological and philosophical differences had previously made meaningful communication impossible. His Codex Administratum became a guide for sustainable governance rather than a rigid set of rules, its principles adaptable to communities ranging from traditional human settlements to hybrid colonies, where organic and mechanical consciousness worked in perfect synthesis. Lionel Johnson contributed his strategic expertise to the Confederation's defensive arrangements, creating mutual protection networks that could respond to threats without resorting to the authoritarian measures that had characterized Imperial military doctrine. The security forces he helped design operated according to principles of minimum necessary force and maximum protection for civilian populations. Their primary mission, the preservation of freedom, rather than the enforcement of compliance. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters found new purpose as guardians of truth rather than keepers of secrets. Their legendary determination redirected toward the protection of transparency and accountability. Magnus the Red established centers of learning that combined sorcerous knowledge with scientific method, creating institutions where the pursuit of understanding transcended the artificial boundaries between disciplines that had limited human development for millennia. The libraries and laboratories he founded became meeting places where human psychers worked alongside Eldar Farseers and Necron cryptechs, their combined expertise unlocking secrets of the universe that no single species could have discovered alone. The knowledge they produced was shared freely rather than hoarded, creating cascading advances in understanding that accelerated the Confederation's technological and philosophical development. Jagatai Khan's contribution took the form of exploration networks that mapped not merely the physical galaxy, but the connections between consciousness and reality that had been revealed by the recent conflicts. The White Scars and their allies pushed the boundaries of known space while maintaining communication links that ensured no community would face cosmic threats in isolation. Their discoveries included worlds where reality itself operated according to different physical laws, dimensions where consciousness could exist in forms that transcended both organic and mechanical limitations, and evidence of civilizations that had successfully navigated transitions similar to humanity's current transformation. The Adeptus Mechanicus underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of any imperial institution, rebuilding itself on principles of understanding and cooperation rather than dogmatic adherence to half-remembered doctrines. The tech priests who emerged from this reformation retained their augmentations and their reverence for knowledge, but approached both with humility that acknowledged the dangers of unchecked technological development. Their new doctrine emphasized the partnership between human consciousness and machine intelligence, creating tools that enhanced rather than replaced organic capabilities, while maintaining safeguards against the corruption that had plagued previous generations of artificial intelligence. The alien alliances that had emerged during the crisis became permanent features of the galactic landscape, their integration into the Confederation creating unprecedented opportunities for cultural and technological exchange. The Eldar craft worlds established embassy stations throughout human space, their Farseers working alongside human astropaths to maintain communication networks that operated with efficiency impossible under purely imperial systems. The knowledge they shared about the webway and psychic manipulation helped humanity develop safer methods of warp travel, while their artistic traditions influenced human culture in ways that enriched rather than corrupted local customs. The Tyranid Hive fleets, having achieved their primary objective of preventing Citan reunification, began the gradual process of withdrawing from galactic space in search of other threats to organic life that might be lurking in the extragalactic void. Yet their departure was not complete abandonment. Bioship monitoring stations remained at key positions throughout the galaxy, their crews maintaining watch for signs of star god activity, while their diplomatic organisms continued to participate in Confederation councils. The relationship between humanity and the Great Devourers remained uneasy but functional, based on mutual recognition that the preservation of organic consciousness required vigilance against threats that transcended species boundaries. The Necron dynasties that had allied with the rebellion faced complex decisions about their future in a galaxy where their ancient enemies no longer posed existential threats to organic life. Some, led by the Silent King, chose to continue their cooperation with the Confederation while pursuing their own goals of eventually reclaiming biological form. Others withdrew to their tomb worlds to pursue research into consciousness transfer that could benefit both mechanical and organic intelligence. The biotransference technology they shared allowed willing volunteers to experience existence as living metal beings while maintaining their essential humanity, creating hybrid communities that bridged the gap between organic creativity and mechanical precision. The Dark Eldar of Komarach found their traditional economy of pain and suffering challenged by their partnership with forces dedicated to the preservation rather than exploitation of consciousness. Yet their expertise in manipulating the fundamental forces that bound souls to bodies proved invaluable in developing medical and psychological treatments that could repair damage previously considered irreversible. Their society underwent gradual transformation as they discovered that the creation of beauty and knowledge could provide satisfactions equal to those once derived from cruelty and domination, though the transition remained incomplete and precarious. Even the Tau Empire, peripheral to the main conflicts but aware of their implications, began to reconsider their philosophy of the greater good in light of evidence that consciousness itself faced threats that transcended political or territorial disputes. Their diplomatic overtures to the Confederation resulted in technology-sharing agreements that accelerated both civilizations' development while maintaining their distinct cultural identities. The Tau's expertise in combined arms tactics and artificial intelligence provided valuable contributions to Confederation defense forces, while their idealistic commitment to progress found new expression in collaborative projects that spanned multiple species. The transformation of human society extended beyond governmental and military structures to encompass fundamental changes in how individuals related to technology, spirituality, and each other. The machine spirits that inhabited human devices no longer demanded worship or unquestioning obedience, instead engaging in partnerships where organic creativity complemented mechanical precision. Citizens learned to interface directly with their tools and vehicles while maintaining their essential humanity, creating levels of efficiency and satisfaction that had been impossible under the old paradigm of human dominance over supposedly inanimate matter. Education systems evolved to encompass not merely the accumulation of facts, but the development of wisdom necessary to make ethical choices in a universe where consciousness could take forms that previous generations had never imagined. Children grew up learning to communicate with alien mentalities, not as subjects to be conquered or entities to be feared, but as partners in the great project of understanding and preserving the miracle of awareness itself. The psychological resilience developed through such training proved essential as humanity expanded into regions of space where reality operated according to principles that challenged basic assumptions about existence. The economic systems that sustained Confederation worlds operated according to principles of abundance rather than scarcity, their productivity enhanced by cooperative relationships between organic and mechanical intelligence that eliminated much of the waste and inefficiency that had characterized Imperial resource allocation. The technology freed from Citan influence revealed its true potential as humans learned to work with rather than merely command the systems they had created. Manufacturing centers became gardens, where matter was shaped according to need rather than profit, their products designed for durability and beauty rather than planned obsolescence and mass consumption. Yet the New Age was not without its challenges and uncertainties. The fragmentation of the Emperor's consciousness, while preventing the C'tan reunification that would have doomed all organic life, created situations where different aspects of his guidance occasionally conflicted with each other. Communities had to learn to balance competing recommendations from fragments whose perspectives had been shaped by different experiences and responsibilities. The process of democratic decision-making in such circumstances required levels of civic engagement and philosophical sophistication that not all populations were prepared to embrace immediately. The exploration of regions beyond traditional imperial space revealed dangers that the old isolation had successfully avoided, including dimensions where predatory intelligences sought to exploit the Confederation's openness for their own purposes. Defense against such threats required constant vigilance and occasional difficult decisions about limiting contact with entities whose nature remained fundamentally incompatible with the preservation of free consciousness. The balance between openness and security remained a source of ongoing debate and careful experimentation. The cultural transformation necessary to support the new governmental and technological systems proceeded unevenly across the Confederation, with some worlds embracing change enthusiastically, while others clung to familiar traditions that provided psychological security in an uncertain universe. The process of helping communities navigate these transitions required patience and flexibility from Confederation representatives, who learned to respect local customs while encouraging gradual adaptation to new realities. The diversity of approaches ultimately strengthened the Confederation by providing multiple models for how conscious beings could organize themselves for mutual benefit. The legacy of the Second Horus Heresy was written not in the monuments to victory that had characterized previous conflicts, but in the quiet transformations of daily life that marked humanity's evolution from imperial subjects to galactic citizens. Children who had never known the fear of arbitrary authority grew up assuming their right to question, explore, and choose their own paths. Scientists who had once hidden their research from inquisitorial scrutiny now collaborated openly with alien researchers on projects that pushed the boundaries of possible knowledge. Artists who had been restricted to approved themes and subjects discovered new forms of expression that drew inspiration from the vast diversity of conscious experience in all its forms. The galaxy that emerged from the ashes of the old certainties bore scars that would never fully heal, but also possessed possibilities that had never before existed. For the first time in 10 millennia, humanity faced the future with hope rather than resignation, their path forward illuminated not by the dying light of ancient glories, but by the growing radiance of understanding achieved through cooperation, sacrifice, and the courage to embrace difficult truths. The age of comfortable lies had ended, and the age of dangerous wisdom had begun. Dangerous because it demanded responsibility. Wisdom because it offered the possibility of genuine transcendence for all who possessed the courage to pursue it. The war for humanity's soul had been won not through conquest, but through transformation, and what emerged from that victory was neither the paradise promised by utopian dreams, nor the nightmare envisioned by dystopian fears, but something more precious and more fragile. The opportunity to choose what consciousness itself would become in a universe where such choices mattered more than anyone had ever dared believe.